back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin here with another huge week of World War III analysis. This is being recorded Friday, August 14th, going into the weekend here. The dog days of summer. It's hot here in central Texas. Of course, the Dormition fast is wrapping up as we're recording this. Tomorrow morning, for me at least, will be the Feast of the Dormition. So if you're on the new calendar, blessed Feast of the Dormition to you. And if you're on the old calendar, good fast, as the fast has just begun. So I hope everybody is staying in tune with the calendar of the church. But of course, things are still heating up in the Middle East. I think, the American media, the Zog media is sort of downplaying what's going on, trying to get people to forget about what is effectively the Iranian victory in the midst of this sort of stalemate ceasefire. At least according to the U.S., there's a ceasefire, as in they are not firing on Iran, but Iran continues to fire on the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan. Yemeni Houthis continue to fire on Saudi Arabia and advance in southwestern Yemen, sort of reigniting the Yemeni civil war that had been on hold since 2022. And of course, things still continue in Lebanon and Palestine. We're going to get into the latest as Egypt apparently wants in on the Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan defense treaty. Of course, Turkey is threatening and still working out details on potentially closing the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits to Russian and Ukrainian traffic. The Black Sea continues to be a major war zone. So we're going to be bringing you updates from all of these fronts and so much more. It's really great to have everyone here with you this evening. Be sure to like this episode on Substack, especially. Really, really helps us out. Be sure to listen to our Ether Hour this past week with Denny from Ubi Petrus. Really, really great stuff. So that is linked down below. Give us a like on whatever platform you happen to be listening on. Get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co to listen to that Ether Hour episode. Leave a comment as well. We'd love to hear what you think in the comments, where you think World War III is going. But with all of that, we will dive right into the analysis here. But before we do that, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. It's been a very packed week full of diplomatic news, multilateral, bilateral threats being thrown around by the United States, by Russia towards Ukraine, towards the European nations, and lots of signaling as well as posturing happening on basically every single war front. Everybody anticipates for things to heat up, both in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe, especially around these major waterfront straits, Bab el-Mandeb, the Hormuz, and the Bosphorus Dardanelles in the near future. So I think all of these nations are well and truly preparing for the major conflict to escalate beyond their control. And so, of course, everybody is gathering power, and we're here to discuss exactly how the chips will fall.
Well, that's exactly what's going on. And of course, prophecies are being fulfilled. We talked about the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. We've never been closer, I think, than seeing that really be fulfilled, to the point where the Russians are going to have to deal with the Turkish question. Of course, Igor Strelkov, who we talk about on the show, talked about this. And of course, this week, the Russians and the Syrians seem to have signed a deal regarding their bases. So we're going to get into that later in the episode. We're going to get into what's going on again in Lebanon and what's going on in Palestine, as Hamas releases statements saying they are supportive of Iran's actions to secure their security in Palestine. And of course, the Iraqi militias and other axis of resistance aligned groups are continuing to threaten Israel and even Syria, as Syria is being goaded into operating against Hezbollah, going into Lebanon and doing the dirty work that the Lebanese military, the United States, and even Israel is clearly incapable of doing. So that's what's going on this week. We're going to have a great week of analysis, of course. But again, subscribe, share, whatever platform you are listening on. Again, get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co. Check out not just this week's Ether Hour episode with Denny from Ubi Petrus, all about his time in the West Bank and the Middle East, but also get behind the paywall to listen to all of the other incredible Ether Hour episodes. Our multiple interviews with Yaqub Saraf, former defense minister of Lebanon, multiple interviews with Syrian Girl, all sorts of experts from the Middle East, former member of the European Parliament, Nick Griffin, Mike Painovich, Warren Baylog, Jim Jatras, Father Peter Hears, of course, our recent episode on preparing for World War III in the midst of the prophecies with him. So get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co and check all of that out. And of course, support the show. It's what keeps the lights on here at the proverbial World War Now bunker, again, at worldwarnow.co. If you're already behind the paywall or you just want to support us for the one time, head over to Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/World War Now. One of the best ways to support us. You can, of course, also find us on YouTube, Telegram, subscribe to us on all those platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. And of course, this episode is sponsored by Antelope Hill Publishing. So head on over to antelopehillpublishing.com and use code WWN for 10% off. They, of course, have the third edition of Culture of Critique. They have The Burning Souls by Leon Degrelle, a book I'm currently reading. So get 10% off those incredible works and a whole host of other incredible, a huge library of dissident literature. So check all of that out at antelopehillpublishing.com. Depleted.com. All of what I just described is linked down below. But of course, we have to hop in to the World War III analysis. And of course, Donald Trump in the past 24 hours has announced that he is defeating Iran very bigly and will soon declare the Strait of Hormuz a territory of the United States. But again, anyone paying attention knows that that is just another insane, boisterous sort of red herring distraction comment, because the Strait of Hormuz is very much under control of the IRGC. They seem, whatever deal they've worked out with the Omanis is sort of irrelevant now. They've openly said that they will not be opening the strait until their maximalist aims are met, which means a full U.S. withdrawal, of course, of the blockade that they are performing against the Iranian ports in the Persian Gulf, but also the actual U.S. bases in the region of Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, all these places. The U.S. needs to officially pull out of all of those places, full sanctions relief on the Iranians, as well as reparations for the war damages, return of their missing funds. And of course, UAE planes are 4 or 5 times, I think, so far this past week, have flown to Iran, dropped off a pallet of cash or gold, and then flown back. This, of course, is a desperate attempt by the United Arab Emirates, I think, to prevent being destroyed in the event of a Iranian response to what will, I think, be an inevitable U.S.-Israeli attack, because this current situation is just untenable. Again, the Strait of Hormuz is closed. We're going to get into the Houthis blockading the Bab el-Mandeb Straits. And again, the situation in Russia, Ukraine with the energy continues to strangle the world oil markets. America's strategic petroleum reserves are at all-time lows. But as far as, again, the situation actually in the Gulf, the U.S. situation this week, the big news was about the USS Abraham Lincoln. Apparently the crew on board, like 5 or 6 people, attempted to jump overboard. Mental health collapses. The rations are dwindling. They're eating slop, tiny little doses of slop, and apparently they can't handle it. They apparently needs to be replacements on the catapults or the launchers that shoot these planes off of the aircraft carriers. They need to resort, I'm no expert on this technology, but they're reverting from like electromagnetic to steam powered of these launchers. So major overhauls, I think, because the deploying technology on these things has proven to be faulty, and they've come across all sorts of problems in many of these aircraft carriers. I'm forgetting which exact one. Was it the Nimitz? Was supposed to be retired, but they had to delay its retirement because of the long deployments of the Gerald R. Ford, which had to get replaced again by the Lincoln, which now apparently is going to be replaced by the USS George Washington. Trump, of course, said that no, the Lincoln hasn't even been deployed for long enough. Him and Hegseth denied the reports of the poor conditions and the pooping and peeing everywhere and the long shifts and the terrible mental health situation, just like they denied a lot of the reports on the Gerald R. Ford, despite the fact that the massive fire that burned all those bunks, all of that was 100% confirmed. So some are saying that the George Washington is going to replace the Lincoln. I'm sort of thinking that maybe they're preparing for a much larger assault, and they're going to have both of them, again, in the CENTCOM area of operation for something larger. Again, in the midst of all of this, over 25% of the U.S. Reaper drone fleet has been destroyed in the midst of this war. Those are the MQ-9 Reapers, sort of the premier strike drones. When there are drone strikes in the Middle East, it's these things that are doing it. And again, compared to previous years, we've never lost more Reapers. I mean, it's 45 Reaper drones have been lost in 2026 alone. In 2025, it was 11. In 2024, it was 9. In 2013, it was 7. And then it was really just 3 or 4 for all the years before that, going back all the way to 2017. So these, of course, are tens of millions of dollars worth of machines that we are completely losing. And again, Iran is still completely controlling the strait. We are not degrading them in any way. In fact, Mojtaba Khamenei has made major appointments in the midst of this sort of lull in the conflict. So many interim heads of IRGC organs were made permanent, and other people were found to fill other positions that had been, rendered empty in the midst of the major U.S.-Israeli assassinations in the midst of the Purim War. But again, it's clear to me that Israel is not done yet. Israel is mulling potential unilateral strikes against Iran. They don't like the current reality, and there's all these reports from Israeli media about how they're shocked at how fast Iran has rearmed, that apparently by 2027, 2028, they will be even more formidable than they were before this war. So again, really a great job on the war to the Pentagon and Trump and CENTCOM. But again, we're getting a lot of reports from the CIA. Obviously, there was the whole thing about the Trump assassination attempt. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the episode. But, apparently the intelligence that apparently led to Trump getting off of Air Force One, getting in that beverage cart and going on this totally different airline because of apparently a fear of an Iranian assassination attempt, that apparently somebody outside of his hotel with a shoulder-mounted rocket was going to shoot down Air Force One as it flew away from Ankara, the NATO summit that Trump went, to, ironically enough, tell Erdogan that he was going to give him F-35s, much against Israel's wishes. Where did this intelligence about the assassination come from? Well, it came from Israel. And apparently the CIA is now saying that they had very low confidence in that intelligence and were not concerned with it and were not reporting it up the chain of command because they didn't think it was really a credible threat. So Israel is once again seeding predictive programming. People are saying this, that Israel is seeding the public consciousness through their media organs and, of course, their intelligence with the idea that, Iran wants to kill Trump. And then, of course, who will likely actually be behind this? Well, the beneficiaries of a supposed Iranian assassination of Trump, Israel, the Zionist entities. So we're going to be discussing all of that later in the episode as well. But as far as the actual situation in the Strait of Hormuz, Dmitry, I'd love to know your thoughts. Again, the Pentagon, the US's playbook is very limited at this point. They aren't willing to do the all-out strikes on Iranian infrastructure and face the retaliation that Iran will mete out on Gulf energy that will plunge the world into the largest energy crisis in, the modern era. They're not willing to do that. They clearly aren't willing to go in with the Kurds in this ground operation. It's clear that that is not something that on the ground logistically is feasible right now. The Iranians have been daily, still to this day, degrading the Kurdish capabilities, striking them with impunity. America has made no kind of attempt to loop them into any kind of ceasefire. So they've just been left out to dry. So as of right now, it's just the U.S. blockade against these Iranian ports, trying to strangle them. We had Scott Jennings saying that, the U.S., Trump as well, saying that we're unleashing the strongest sanctions ever against Iran. So they still have that going, but the Iranians are striking ships daily that are trying to pass through the straits. Mines are still being hit. These small boats are still able to do damage. So what do you think the Pentagon is thinking here? As far as I can tell, Trump is just going to keep waiting and waiting for his economic plans to work, basically just waiting until Israel drags us all back into this with a unilateral strike, just like they did in the Purim War, just like they did back in June 2025 with the 12-Day War. So again, us Goyim can sit on here on these podcasts and talk, and Trump can talk to his Goyim advisors, and the Gulf Goyim can talk all day and try to form their new peace treaties between Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and try to prevent all of this from happening. And the Iranians can, build everything up and not attack and not retaliate strongly. And the Goyim can do everything they can. But at the end of the day, when the Jews are going to do, the Jews are going to do, and they're going to drag America back into this, whether Trump and the other Goyim like it or not. So I'd love your thoughts on what you think is coming next, Dmitry. Are we going to see some kind of limited ground operation on the islands? Again, we still have a lot of the USS Boxer, these amphibious vehicles are still puttering around out there. We're about to have 2 aircraft carriers ostensibly in the region. So I'm curious where you think this is going.
No, it's not looking very good. And of course, Israel and Bibi Netanyahu, the Likud party, this is the millstone around the neck that's going to, of course, plunge the U.S. military-industrial complex into the depths of another prolonged Middle Eastern war in which, ostensibly the U.S. is already engaged in. And very unfortunately, this over-investment into the Sea of Arabia, as you said earlier, this massive combination of destroyers, aircraft carriers, the U.S. fleet is building up strength. At the moment, you do have the much smaller George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier and, of course, the Lincoln, as well as the George Washington joining it. Of course, the difference is that the Lincoln and the George Washington can launch via their specific catapults on board those F-35C stealth fighters that can fly very long ranges and long durations, and of course bomb Iran from a significant distance and provide air support to any B-1s, B-52s, or B-2s that'll be flying in from various air bases, be it in Europe and at the Fairford base in the United Kingdom, or even Diego Garcia, located south of the Sea of Arabia in the Indian Ocean, where the B-2 bombers are stationed. So in fact, the aircraft carriers are all prepared, and naturally there's also the inevitable support coming in, no doubt, from their NATO ally of France if the Charles de Gaulle ever needs to leave port. At the moment, the Charles de Gaulle is refueling. They are refurnishing and, of course, resupplying that particular aircraft carrier. But if the Bab el-Mandeb is closed indefinitely for all, shall we say, maritime trade and not just Saudi Arabian exports and imports in the near future, I think we may see French involvement as well. We've also, of course, seen this past year the Prince of Wales, which at the moment is located somewhere around the Norwegian waters. That's the United Kingdom's aircraft carrier was also involved in the Eastern Mediterranean so-called peacekeeping maneuvers to defend the British base was located on the island of Cyprus. So there could be an escalation that would lead to eventually 5 aircraft carriers being operating in this particular Middle Eastern water theater. And all of this, of course, comes around in the context of the Turks closing the Bosphorus and Dardanelles and essentially preventing any Russian naval expeditions into the Eastern Mediterranean, and of course the complexities that come from that. So you won't necessarily see any Russian support for Iran coming in from the naval maritime side. At least we won't be anticipating that in the near future. Besides, of course, any assistance the Russians can provide the Iranians via the Caspian. But it is very interesting how the CENTCOM overinvestment in this particular conflict, the rhetoric coming out of CENTCOM, the posturing of Scott Bessent saying that, we can strangle Iran economically. And it's almost as if no one's really seeing seeing what's coming in the near future, not just the midterm elections in November, which we've discussed quite often, but that Israel will have a wonderful pretext. As my friend Keith mentioned on an X Space recently, Israel has the absolute most necessary pretext to commence a black swan anti-American, anti-Iranian event in the Middle East because there are Israeli Knesset, that is Israeli parliamentary elections coming around on the 27th of October, 2026. So in a few months' time, the Israelis will be, no doubt, the majority of the Israeli citizens are really fed up, especially the left-wing Israelis. And Israel does have a large left-wing LGBTQ alphabet community population that will be trying to vote out Netanyahu and his party, and of course try to turn Israel around from this near-death position that it's in at the moment, where it's trying to provoke multiple nations at once and multiple paramilitary organizations to fight against it. I think they want to scale back Israel's hawkish, predatory foreign policy, but that, of course, Netanyahu and the hardcore Zionist factions within Israel will not allow that election to go through and happen. So my anticipation is that there will be a major escalation point before that October Israeli election so that the elections can be put on hold. And Netanyahu, frankly, he himself has already confirmed that, look, the elections may need to be frozen or carried over into the future if Iran escalates against us, if there are national security threats. You can't have Israelis, voting in via mail-in ballots, etc., just like, during the COVID years in the United States of America. But in any case, there were these big concerns coming up in the near future, especially as the U.S. continuously positions its fleet very close to Iranian waters within strike distance. Of course, you also have the Houthis escalating against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And we also understand that as soon as Donald J. Trump, he's already escalated on every single front possible, Conrad, besides two particular things that Trump hasn't really done yet, which he may do in the near future. That is strike expressly and explicitly against civilian targets within Iran. That is the energy production facilities, energy distribution facilities, striking against major Iranian bridges, which frankly in the south of Iran, he's already done that. But if he begins striking at highways, cutting off some of these roads that lead through the Iranian plateau, the desert region, which may cut off entire strips of provinces away from others. And of course, this is the reasoning behind this would be from CENTCOM and the Trump administration is that, look, we're going to be damaging Iranian military logistics, cutting off military bases from one another, etc. But striking at these civilian facilities will lead Iran to, of course, signal towards Ansar Allah, the Yemeni Houthis, to close the Bab el-Mandeb for everyone. And this will, of course, plunge the region into a further, more exacerbated conflict that will not end nicely, I think, for the entire world, including, of course, those located in Africa, some of the third world nations around the world. The global south is going to suffer significantly from the major famines, the shortages in goods being exchanged in this new globalized world that the technocrats of society have built after the Second World War, where every nation is not self-sufficient and everyone's reliant on each other. What happens when the world escalates in a globalized sort of sphere? And of course, things become disrupted, global trade falls apart. And this is exactly where Trump is, instead of course, pursuing any sort of diplomatic means to end this particular conflict, especially now during this multi-week, more or less relative standstill that's happening. Trump, in a way, is almost, standing to attention. He's saluting and waiting for Netanyahu to fire the start gun. And of course, Netanyahu no doubt will be doing that before the end of October. And this is the saddest part, is that Trump right now can say, look, we're going home, the fleets are retreating, we're at least scaling back the bases. The American bases are already apparently going to be leaving Iraq in its totality. The Americans have already said that by the end of the year, we'll be leaving Iraq. The Americans have apparently already left Syria. There are major scale back operations taking place, which no doubt will be in some ways concessions, at least even temporarily, to the Iranians. But at this point, I think, Conrad, we will see, of course, a huge escalation coming up in the near future against some of the American targets, be it on the land or even on the sea. And at this stage, the only thing the Iranians really haven't done against the American forces is strike expressly at these aircraft carriers located in the Sea of Arabia, which they have threatened to do in the past. And we've seen also similar threats coming out from Russian geopolitical analysts. There's all this talk about what will happen if an aircraft carrier besieges a nation which has hypersonic missile capabilities. And the theory, at least for decades now, that's been discussed and maybe even in an oversimplified manner spoken about too often, is that an hypersonic missile can pierce the surface-to-air missile defense systems of an aircraft carrier, and it can destroy an aircraft carrier before the aircraft carrier can dodge and move out of the way or take any sort of defensive maneuvers. And that, I think, is probably the end point escalation that we are all waiting for. But inevitably, I think, Conrad, there is going to be this major push for war against Iran to restart and reignite, and neither Oman nor Pakistan nor the Sunni Muslim Ummah will be standing in the way in front of a new wave of war crimes against the innocent Iranian people. And this is not to say that, of course, the Iranian regime is not preparing. Certainly with these new appointments, they absolutely are. And the new appointments are absolutely not fictitious or random or not significant. There is a new leader of the Iranian Navy. Of course, Admiral Sayari has been appointed. There's General Haidari, a senior armed forces commander, appointed. And these are apparently appointed by the IRGC. These are skilled personnel who have already held senior positions within the Iranian military structure and the IRGC specifically. They're being appointed by the supreme leader himself. There is, of course, the biggest appointment this week, of course, is General Vahidi. So he's the new IRGC commander-in-chief. He's, I dare say, target number 2 after the supreme leader himself. So all these generals and officials within the Iranian military, you will not see them walking around the streets of Tehran or Isfahan. They're going to be hidden well away in military-designated command center positions and bunkers. There's a new besieged commander as well, General Tayeb. And of course, the besieged are important because this is the structure that will be mobilizing a large portion of the Iranian population if there is a multi-front ground invasion of Iran from, the various fronts, be it Iraq, the Kurds, and the south of Iran. The besieged will be heavily involved in sort of defending major Iranian villages and towns. And just as you see in the Russo-Ukrainian theater, no doubt about that, there will be this slowing down of any enemy encroachment advances into these major small towns and villages. So the Iranian, just like the Ukrainians, are not giving up territory easily against the Russians. No doubt you will see the besieged and the IRGC and the official army of Iran trying to slow down any advancements through Iranian territory. They will turn it not just into a scorched earth tactic that the ancient Scythians used against the Persian invaders, or, in 400 BC, for example, but you will see the Iranians actually fighting for every shred of land that they can in order to, again, make this as costly a military expedition by the West and by, unfortunately, the Talmudically controlled nations as possible. And so, no doubt about this will be one of the bloodiest wars of the 21st century. It will definitely eclipse the Iraq War of 2003, and perhaps it will even, of course, overcome in terms of sheer loss of life the current Russo-Ukrainian conflict, the special military operation. So we're literally on the doorstep of something that will be so major. It will define, I think, at least the next 50 years, and will be this cascading position that will no doubt lead to some of the other prophetic wars, for example, the Russo-Turkish conflict and other major wars. This will be the foreshadowing of those apocalyptic wars that will, lead us into the next century. And no doubt the U.S. is now Israel is leading the U.S. into its unfortunate military demise, dare I say, and the demise of the American reputation in world affairs and among all the nations of the world, yes.
Now, those appointments by the supreme leader are very critical, and it's important to realize that you say Ahmad Vahidi, probably target number 1. I would say right now the 3 most powerful people in Iran are Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi, and the new Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council of Iran, Mohsen Rezaian. He is, the Supreme National Security Council has 2 members directly appointed by the Supreme Leader and also a secretary. Mohsen Rezaian is now the secretary and one of the directly appointed members by the Supreme Leader, making him also basically the Supreme Leader's main military security advisor. So I think those are now the 3 most powerful people in Iran that would become targets of assassination as well. Notice how Pezeshkian, people remember from 2 weeks ago, Pezeshkian apparently was threatening, doing the classic sort of a reformist protest move. They're threatening the supreme leader with their resignation, saying, I'll resign if this doesn't happen. Apparently, Mojtaba Khamenei had given enough and said, if you resign, I will accept your resignation and we will just have new elections or we'll have an interim president. And apparently that called Pezeshkian and assumably Galibaf and Aragchi's bluff. They withdrew. And apparently, Mohsen Rezea was appointed to some of his positions even by Pezeshkian himself, which I'm sure he wouldn't have normally done. So Aragchi, Pezeshkian, Galibaf, they seem to have been relegated now to making official approved statements. And again, the IRGC, the supreme leader himself, and Mohsen Rezea, who again was for one of the longest periods of time the commander of the IRGC as well. He, of course, is a hardliner, somebody that wants to exact maximum, I think, retribution on the United States. He was the one that made this comment this past week in a meeting with the Chinese ambassador to Iran. He said the Strait of Hormuz will not open until the United States changes its behavior and accept Iran's conditions. The United States must end the war, release Iran's blocked funds, and in general, the war must end throughout the region, including Lebanon and Gaza, and other conditions that have been conveyed through intermediaries. If an agreement is reached between Iran and Oman regarding the passage route in the Strait of Hormuz, this agreement will be separate from the issue of closing the Strait of Hormuz. This is according to Tasnim, the main IRGC-related sourcing news outlet. And this same week, a senior advisor to the Iranian military in Tehran, this was Mohammad Reza Nagdi, who is senior IRGC advisor. He said, one way is to prolong this war until we get to the next term of the presidency and cause attrition, so that if anyone else wants to attack Iran, they will know there is a cost. We have to attain deterrence so that the enemy never dares to attack us, so we can live with security. And so again, it's clear that the Iranians are pushing and pushing. Again, they continue to keep the strait closed. They continue to support their allies in the axis of resistance in Yemen, in Iraq, who are threatening, for example, operations against their other allies and Hezbollah. We're going to get into the Syria question here in a second. But again, as the Strait of Hormuz continues to remain closed, less ships than the U.S. claims are getting out, undoubtedly. Of course, the Iranians are facing some economic pressure. The sanctions that are about to hit are going to hit them again, and the blockade on their ports is hurting. But they still have a lot of overland routes, especially to China, that they're able to export a lot of this through. And China, unlike America, does not have a almost empty strategic petroleum reserve, which, again, the strategic petroleum reserve situation and just around the world, the energy crunch is being mostly exacerbated at this point by the Yemeni Houthis and their blockade of Saudi energy on their Red Sea ports. Because again, nothing's getting out of the Persian Gulf, so overland pipelines and trucks and trains are taking all this Saudi oil over to their ports on the Red Sea, and they're trying to go through the Bab el-Mandeb. Now they're either having to go up to the Suez Canal, take multiple more weeks to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, all the way down South Africa to make it to Asia, and which again is getting supply lines way out of whack. Or, they have to brave the passage and get struck by Houthi missiles, which again, multiple Indian and Indonesian workers on multiple ships have been killed by these missiles. So the Yemenis are not messing around. Just on Thursday, they hit several ships in the region, and they continue to also strike Saudi energy itself, which is probably the most devastating part of all of this. The Houthis have struck facilities in Jazan, and I don't know all the names of these Arab places. There's a whole bunch of them, but 2 or 3 different facilities on top, of course, the Egpyt facility, which they struck and damaged, the largest oil refinery in the world, which again, I don't think has been brought back online at all yet. So the situation with the Houthis and Saudi Arabia continues to escalate. The Saudis are afraid to launch a full-scale retaliation. They're working through their proxies. We're going to get into the advances in a second, because currently Ansar Allah and the Yemenis are advancing against the Presidential Leadership Council, which are the Saudi-backed proxy, advancing against them in the southwest of Yemen. If you look at a map, you see it's only the southwest of Yemen that's the only part of the Red Sea coast at all, really, that is controlled by non-Ansar Allah forces. And that place now, it seems it's about to fall to the Houthis as we speak. So we'll get into that in a second. But the situation in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf with the energy is not sustainable. This is one of the main reasons why we are not escalating attacks on Iran. And Iran aren't even the ones doing these strikes. The Saudis, for example, we discussed this a few weeks ago, they wanted to blame the Iraqi militias who are still threatening retaliation against Saudi Arabia. But they apparently, stopped their retaliation because of the Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Pakistan defense agreement. But people are wondering, how effective will that agreement be? Well, apparently not at all, because I haven't seen Turkey or Pakistan do anything against the Houthis in the past few weeks, again, to stop any of this, despite the fact that they're disabling Saudi energy facilities and destroying major weapons caches, weapons shipments, and actual personnel of the Saudi-backed Presidential Leadership Council, which is technically the quote-unquote internationally recognized government of Yemen. So that's the situation there, Dmitry. Before we talk about the actual Houthi advances on the ground, what are your thoughts on these actual strikes against Saudi Arabia and the energy situation as, again, the Bab el-Mandeb and the Strait of Hormuz are closed? We're going to talk about the Bosphorus and Dardanelles here in a second. And of course, we know that the Straits of Malacca are always a place of contention for the U.S. and China. But it seems like, I mean, we're getting more straits, more, there's only a few of these critical straits around the world. We're getting to the point where the majority of them are going to be closed.
Certainly, and I think it is coming up to that time. Look, we are more or less 5 months into the future after the commencement of the Purim War, and the scale of escalation, especially in the Straits, the disruption to shipments, specifically the disruption to oil shipments to countries like the People's Republic of China. These are incredibly concerning because China, obviously, it's largely fuels the world economy in a very major way. And as soon as the Orient, the East Asian nations, as well as India, begin experiencing these shortages in fuel and diesel, etc., and the oil refineries begin to go dry, the strategic reserves which China has, in fact, accumulated, and there was speculation as to how much exactly China did have in storage, for the next 6 to 12 months, and who exactly can accommodate the supplies that China may experience shortage in. Can Russia, for example, provide the fuel that was coming in from the Middle East in prior years? Could there be any substitutes provided? I think we'll be seeing, and look, China has been very quiet on the entire issue. We'll be seeing, for example, more pressure from the People's Republic of China, from Xi Jinping and his government, actually onto Iran for Iran to come to the table and actually to agree to some sort of decision that may be less than sovereign and less than, shall we say, positive for the Iranian people, because of these economic concerns. They're only going to be exacerbated by this particular conflict's escalation, especially if various oil refineries as well as oil extraction facilities within the GCC states will begin getting hit, which no doubt will happen. This is one of the targets that Iran has threatened against openly, so any escalation will lead to that. And the Houthis are already basically giving us a taste of what will happen when the Bab el-Mandeb Straits will be closed in their entirety. So at the moment, obviously, the last sort of pipeline that is of extreme importance that the Houthis haven't really struck at expressly, that is still operating, is that east-west 1,200-kilometer pipeline going across Saudi Arabia from the Persian Gulf all the way into the Red Sea. And as soon as the Houthis, if this war between the Houthis and the Saudis continues, the Houthis strike against that pipeline, if they even damage it to some extent, maybe shutting it down, taking it offline. And look, things have happened in previous conflicts in Russia, Ukraine. There have been gas pipelines, oil pipelines that have been put on hold, taken offline by various, shall we say, ambiguous explosions or terror acts, or even, for example, the gas Nord Stream 2 pipeline, for example. We still don't know necessarily who exactly conducted the operation to take that out. It's very possible that any energy pipeline being involved around the GCC states is a plausible target for either the Houthis or the Iranians in the coming weeks, and this will only lead to, again, more pressure coming in from those eastern countries, from the BRICS nations, which are technically geopolitically supposed to be more aligned with Iran, and no doubt they are, but when their economic interests will be targeted and hurt, how will they respond, and what exactly criticism will they put upon Iran? That's, I think, an interesting angle to all of this. The other, of course, aspect is that there are, of course, people like Kirill Dmitriev, all these random center-left people within the Russian state who are claiming that, well, actually the price of oil going up and this economic crisis for the Russians is actually a good thing because, well, the price of diesel will go up, Russian oil, Russian gas will become a greater commodity in world trade. It's much more needed. Russian fossil fuels will become much more expedient to sell. But the issue here is, of course, that Russian refineries are being hit constantly by the Ukrainians, who are also allied with the U.S. This is all incredibly tactical. President Putin has already mentioned that there is this plan by European NATO states to seize Russian so-called covert vessels transporting oil to various countries around the world. So Russia will not necessarily instantaneously benefit from Middle Eastern conflict, of course, being blown out of proportion. And some of these sea routes, if closed in their entirety, some of these straits, there's no guarantee that the Iranians or the Houthis will essentially allow these random flagships under various miscellaneous flags, for example, of Caribbean or African countries to bypass, but just because they claim that they are Russian. So I don't think there's any necessarily benefit to the so-called countries adjacent to the axis of resistance in the long term. That is Russia, China, those countries that have been supporting Iran, the Houthis, and the former government of Syria. And eventually, Conrad, this particular conflict will lead to every nation of the world suffering somewhat in equal part. But first and foremost, I think the United States will feel it very well and truly at home, because they'll be suffering not just economically, but also in the loss of human life that the US simply, I think, just isn't used to anymore, especially after the long, steady decline of further after the ending of the war on terror, or at least the announcement that ISIS has been defeated, al-Baghdadi has died like a dog, etc. So that particular conflict, now that it's over, I think the US public is just not ready for a new conflict on even more ambiguous terms and conditions. So this war between the Houthis and the GCC sort of coalition, dare I say, because the UAE is in part and maybe will become involved very, very soon. This Houthi-Saudi war, I think, will lead to an eventual major escalation in the Red Sea. And no doubt it'll be very interesting to see exactly where Egypt will come out and support. Will there be any sort of pressure from the Chinese located in Djibouti, which is very close to the Gulf of Aden, and the Bab el-Mandeb, and exactly what position will countries such as Ethiopia, Eritrea take in this particular stance? Because all these conflicts will be taking place literally in their backyard, right next door, and they will impact them economically as well. As we know already, Turkey and Somalia essentially stand united, and you do have this strange Somaliland-Israel alliance as well. So that entire Horn of Africa, weird, shall we say, dual coalition situation, I think, in the context of the Bab el-Mandeb and the Houthis escalating against the Saudis, all of this will come really into effect. We'll see these stories develop, and they all tie in some way to the Sudanese civil war as well. We have various GCC states supporting the groups located there, and of course the unfortunate genocide taking place there. It has been going on for a while now. I think overall, Iran at the moment, Conrad, is doing its maximal to remain as sovereign as possible and to sort of defend its interests and to protect its allies in the region, to retain as much power as possible, especially now that they're under pressure from not just the United States, but the GCC to entirely back down and to surrender all of their interests, even after suffering all of these major losses of human life, thousands of Iranians dead at this point. Key military leaders have been killed, and there's still been no apologies. There's been no sort of position to rectify or to provide any sort of recompense for what the Iranians have suffered. The MOU was maybe the closest thing to a deal that was in some way the Iranians could potentially take. And even that, the supreme leader was sort of eyeing that with a raised eyebrow. And now that has been backtracked on. I don't think there's any prospects for short-term peace coming up in this particular conflict, very unfortunately.
No, I very much agree. And again, this goes back to what Nick Griffin and what we've been talking about for a while, how, again, I think not just an American, but still an Israeli positive externality of all this war is the slow, it could have been quick, but it will also go slow, destruction of Gulf energy. I mean, it's just these other Muslim monarchies. Look, sure, the Saudis and the Emiratis most definitely are more favorable to Israel than the Iranians, but Israel hates all of these goyim, and all of these goyim occupy, at least especially the Saudis and others, occupy areas that they view as, parts of greater Israel. So them slowly destroying each other is a benefit. And of course, the U.S. broadly benefits, especially Qatari LNG. They become the world LNG provider. They just seized Venezuelan oil. They'll be able to export that around the world. And again, blockade China, stop them at the Panama Canal stop the Venezuelan oil from going there at all. And then, of course, we've reclaimed and reasserted our authority over the Panama Canal. So all of these different, again, venues and different methods of, choking our enemies out of energy and becoming energy dominant ourselves. I mean, again, that's how we catch up to Russia, who it's the same kind of technocratic thinking as Kirill Dmitriev, who's like, oh, see, we benefit from this as the Russians because of our exports. Yeah, well, the Americans are thinking of that the same way because they also have, a lot of domestic energy at home. And in the aftermath of all of this, of course, again, just today, facilities in Jazan, facilities in Najran in Saudi Arabia, these are massive oil facilities, have been struck. Fires are rising from the port in Mocha after 4 ballistic missile strikes touched down, destroying entirely 2 Saudi military boats that were dropping off trucks, cargo ships, equipment, all sorts of these other things. So the Houthis are really advancing again towards the Mocha and Hayes areas, the final regions, again, on the coast of the Red Sea that they haven't occupied yet, making it even easier for them to blockade the Red Sea. Of course, Dmitry, you talked about Africa, Somaliland. It's shocking. I mean, Saudi Arabia, for sheer practicality, is going to eventually have to get on board with the UAE Somaliland and Israel Somaliland project because it's going to be the best way to defend against the Houthis. And you consider that with the situation in Sudan, you start to see, it's going to start to break down some of these alliances in the Muslim Ummah, right? I mean, you have the Sudanese armed forces, the junta, who are ostensibly supported by, I guess, Belarus, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, you have the Rapid Support Forces who are recently just launching incursions and new offensives in from Ethiopian territory and apparently even South Sudan, supported by the United Arab Emirates most formally, as well as Israel, and again, Ethiopia and some of these other aligned countries in the region there. So that's how all of that is breaking down. Again, the Russians, I think, have supplied both sides in that conflict in some capacity. So it's all a big mess. Again, it's a war. It's already a regional war. It's even a multi-region war. And we all, as those listeners of WWN know, it's all a big part of the World War, the Third World War. But it is undoubtedly an expanding conflict, and what we're experiencing right now is a low burn hot conflict. It's still hot. Again, ships are being struck every day. People are being killed in Iraq from the Iranian strikes. Israel's advancing on the ground in Lebanon. Syria's attempting to be brought into all of this. It's just the U.S. is trying to keep it under control because they don't control the escalation ladder. They no longer have deterrence, and it is the Iranians who are controlling the kind of the tempo of the conflict, and they are the ones that are setting the terms right now, which is very, very bad for the United States. So the media is not talking about it as much. They're trying to kind of regain control of the ship and then eventually get back to narrative control and all of that. But again, I still think it's more likely that Israel just drags them into another confrontation at their speed before America, Trump, and all these people actually come up with some kind of plan, because all of those at this point have completely failed. But of course, in Lebanon, the plan there is also failing. On Wednesday, this is from antiwar.com, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz was laying out plans for the open-ended Israeli occupation of parts of Lebanon, Syria, and the Gaza Strip. Those statements weren't in any way out of the ordinary and very much in keeping with Israel's stated policy, which is to continue the wars and to continue to occupy territories. This didn't sit well with U.S. officials, apparently, and the State Department issued an unusual rebuke of the Israeli policy, reiterating U.S. support for Lebanon's sovereignty and that Katz's occupation would violate the understandings reached in various U.S.-brokered Israel-Lebanon deals. To be clear, none of those agreements ever actually mandated a timeline for the Israeli withdrawal, but just presented a vague sense that at some point in the future, the occupation might conceivably come to an end. In that sense, Katz will doubtless argue that Israel isn't violating anything, and Katz simply ordered a preparing for a long-term presence. Lebanese officials, for their part, are accusing the Israeli government of violating international law with their ongoing attacks on southern Lebanon and their systemic demolition of civilian infrastructure across the occupied area. Meanwhile, U.S. involvement in the invasion and occupation of Lebanon hasn't exactly been pro-peaceful resolution, which is the subject of a new lawsuit filed in a Michigan court against Secretary of State Marco Rubio and multiple U.S. military contractors. The lawsuit was filed by the Arab American Civil Rights League and seeks class action status for tens of thousands of Lebanese Americans who lived in or owned property within Lebanon that was destroyed by the U.S.-backed Israeli invasion. The lawsuit cites the Leahy Law, which prohibits the state and defense departments from providing aid to foreign forces amid evidence of gross violations of human rights, and argues that Israeli war crimes in Lebanon, which have been repeatedly documented, have failed to produce any tangible change in U.S. support for the IDF. Among the individual plaintiffs, and blah, 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 that's far from being an isolated incident. Katz was bragging earlier this week of Israel totally wiping out 24 villages in southern Lebanon and tens of thousands of homes that have been demolished in the Israeli invasion destruction, which is still ongoing. How many of those homes have a U.S. citizen connection is unclear, but it's pretty much a foregone conclusion given the size of the Lebanese diaspora in the U.S. that Beidoun is just one of many. So these are the American plaintiffs suing the state for this. Again, in the midst of all of this, apparently Israel is awaiting a green light to completely occupy and seize the Ali al-Tahrir Hill in southern Nabatea. As we are recording this right now, apparently Hezbollah forces have countered heavily, destroying an Israeli tank. Heavy casualties apparently are being reported. And earlier today, Yedioth Aharonot reported that Israel was still awaiting the green light from President Trump to seize the heights and the strategic underground Hezbollah fortress where dozens of fighters are thought to be besieged. And apparently the green light has been given, so we are witnessing new battles in the south of Lebanon again, as Joseph Ayoun and everyone moans and cries that, oh, we're going to get them out, we have to do this, but we have to also disarm Hezbollah. So that's the situation. And if this continues to go on and Hezbollah continues to resist and fight back, we know that Israel is not capable of defeating them. So Trump and Israel continue to lean on al-Jawlani, al-Shara, and Damascus to move in to take on Hezbollah. Apparently on the ground, rumblings are moving more in that direction, but apparently in response to this, Syrian forces have reportedly deployed additional heavy reinforcements along the Iraqi border and intensified contact with Sunni factions in western Iraq in response to Iranian-backed Shiite militias threatening to open a new front against Syria if Damascus moves against Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iran also informed Syria through Turkey that hundreds of locations would be targeted with drones and missiles throughout Syria, including the presidential palace, if the Syrian army intervened in Lebanon against Hezbollah. This is from the Tasnim agency again. Following the warning, which took place weeks ago, Syria turned down its anti-Hezbollah rhetoric and privately reassured Tehran and Beirut that it would not intervene in Lebanon. But again, we're hearing more of these rumblings kick up again. But again, in response to all of this, and in response to, I read earlier, Mohsen Razea saying that Lebanon and Gaza must be included in any kind of long-term regional understanding. Hamas issued a statement, said the Islamic resistance movement Hamas has a very positive assessment of the statements of Mr. Mohsen Razea, Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council of Iran, on the necessity of ending the war in the entire region, including Lebanon and Gaza. Stopping these wars is a great benefit for the region, its people, and its future, and their continuation only serves the plans of the Zionist enemy, plans that are based on dividing the region, destabilizing it, and exploiting its resources. So everyone in the region generally is in support of what Iran is doing. Of course, the Syrians are being cleaved away, and Israel is doing its best to influence everyone else. But, the Egyptians, who have always been, very much paid off by the Israelis, the situation with Egypt is becoming more relevant because we had a picture recently. It was Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia, bin Farhan Hakan Fidan of Turkey, and Egypt's Abdelati. They met in Alamein in Egypt, and Egyptian sources close to the foreign ministry report talks focused on resolving outstanding differences between Cairo and Riyadh, with Turkey acting as a mediator. Meanwhile, the New Arab, citing its own sources, states Cairo is now seriously considering joining the Mecca Agreement after key differences with Riyadh were resolved. And that's, of course, the defense agreement between Turkey, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. And in the midst of all of this news, this is from Mahmoud Alouk. It says Erdogan is expected to visit Damascus before the year's end, signaling a new phase in Turkish-Syrian relations. A well-known analyst and political researcher who specializes in Turkish and Middle Eastern geopolitics says President Erdogan will visit Syria before the end of the current year, according to the announcement by the Turkish ambassador to Damascus, who stated that nothing gladdens Erdogan at present more than praying in the Umayyad Mosque. The visit has been delayed, likely due to security reasons and others tied to Syria's internal security situation following the transition, but the circumstances have now become conducive to it and will undoubtedly constitute a major new turning point in Turkish-Syrian relations and in Turkey's engagement in supporting Syria. And of course, we know there are prophecies and predictions from elders of Erdogan being killed, assassinated, shot down, potentially on his way back from Syria. And again, we heard recently, again, I talked about this in my live stream this week, we got news apparently of a 2016 plan in the midst of the coup in Turkey to shoot Erdogan's plane down as he fled. So with all of this, we're also going to talk about the Trump assassination attempt, as I said earlier. But before we do all of that, Dmitry, what are your thoughts on the situation between Egypt potentially joining the Mecca Agreement, as well as everything else going on in Lebanon, Palestine, with the Iran and the Iraqi militias threatening to intervene if Syria gets involved in Lebanon? Where are you thinking the region? Where are you thinking some of these things are? What are the most relevant, I guess, of these fronts that are going to go anywhere? Do you think Egypt's going to join the Mecca Agreement? Again, Egypt has been, pretty out of the rest of these struggles as far as being a major population center of the Ummah. I mean, they've probably been the most checked out of anybody. I mean, it wasn't until those recent strikes on those American oil facilities near the Suez Canal exit that people even remembered that Egypt was much involved. I mean, they watched the Gaza genocide happen and did absolutely nothing. So I'd love your thoughts on Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Palestine, all of that.
These visits by the foreign minister of Turkey, Hakan Fidan, both to Libya and Egypt this week have been, I think, absolutely huge in terms of the prospects they open up for some sort of Ummah collaboration. At the very least, these are major signals of Turkey, and I think they were aimed at actually explaining to Israel, look, Turkey still has this Sunni Muslim influence, because Libya as well is 97%, 96% Sunni Muslim. I mean, they have their own issues with Wahhabi, Salafis, basically Sunni Islam factions within Libya in the past have basically turned into these more radicalized forms of GCC, Sunni Islam in the past, but specifically both governments in Libya are basically at this point happy to meet with this Turkish representative of the growing future caliphate, if we can call it, of the non-ISIS version. And Hakan Fidan met, of course, with the prime minister of the Libyan National Unity government in Tripoli. This is probably the more pro-Western government, Prime Minister Dbeibeh. And what's interesting is Prime Minister Dbeibeh and Hakan Fidan, as they were sitting on a couch, there was a particular plaque located between them. So this, I believe it was made out of ivory or some sort of white stone. It was an octagonal plaque, quite large. You couldn't wrap both your hands around it, and depicted on it, and there was a zoomed in shot. It was actually showing on a white background the map of basically Arab Palestine with all the Palestinian original names all the locations within the Holy Land. You had a flag of Palestine on the side of the map of Palestine itself. I mean, there were no Israeli names on this particular map. Everything was in Arabic. There was the keys of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and at the top it had a particular message which said, "We are returning." So it's very clear that, at least in order to appeal, I suppose, to the Libyan Sunni Muslim population, even in a pro-Western, shall we say, more EU-centric cities such as Tripoli of the National Unity Government, Hakan Fidan and the Turkish government were basically saying, look, we actually support the Palestinian project, at the very least a two-state solution, if not this anti-Israeli agenda. Again, this is all, I suppose, virtue signaling at this point, because Turkey really hasn't done anything for the Palestinian people properly yet. They still continue, especially through their ally Azerbaijan, and officially importing all kinds of goods, exporting goods to Israel. They continue to sell oil, gas to Israel, and they haven't necessarily even blockaded Israel in any capacity. And the Turkish fleet, we see it, although posturing against the Greeks and against the Greek Cypriots, we haven't really seen Turkey do anything of consequence in the Eastern Mediterranean in relation to the Israeli war crimes against either the Lebanese or the Palestinians. So at this point, it's been all talk, but I do think Israel, Conrad, does fear some sort of Turkish coalition from the north and the south, right? Because we do also see Hakan Fidan visiting General Haftar in the National Stability Government, which is located, the majority of Libya is, of course, under General Haftar's control, or I believe Field Marshal Haftar, if I'm not correct. And he's, of course, very interesting, almost like the Lukashenko of North Africa, right? He has that typical mustache. He's a very tall man, very, close to 2 meters in height. He's a polyglot. He can speak fluent Arabic, fluent Russian, French, etc., multiple languages. He was there with Gaddafi when Gaddafi's government took power in the first place in the Libyan coup that took place all those decades ago. He's somebody who's been around for a very, very long time. And eventually he did turn against his old ally and friend Gaddafi for probably personal reasons, and probably a specialized episode we could have gone to this about the 2011 war. But specifically, I do think Hakan Fidan visiting all three of these respective governments, Egypt and the 2 Libyan governments at the same time, literally within 7 days, basically Palestine being a major subject, Turkish Sunni Muslim unity being a major subject. I think this is obviously trying to signal to the Israelis, do not double-cross Turkey. We do have allies south of your border, specifically Egypt. I just want to mention, we all recall the major Israeli battles and, of course, the insane airstrikes that the Israelis successfully carried out in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. If you haven't done any reading about this, our dear listeners, do read about what happened when the Israelis struck out against the Egyptian airports in that 1973 war, which ended very, very quickly. But basically, the Israelis destroyed at least 300 Egyptian aircrafts in their hangars, in their airstrips, before I believe a single Egyptian plane even took off in that very surprise strike. But the Egyptian Air Force, over the last 53 years, that's how long it's been since the Yom Kippur War, has been rebuilt. They have over 1,000 Air Force units. The Egyptians have a massive ground army as well. And, just by sheer numbers, they could probably overwhelm the Israelis if they struck from the south. And yes, although the Israelis do have air superiority, they do have high quality planes. They have ballistic missiles of their own sort. And of course, the Israeli military has been receiving on-the-ground experience at this point, genociding both the Lebanese, attacking the Syrians and the Palestinians for years now. The Egyptians really have been out of practice, so to speak, but the Egyptians could potentially even overwhelm the Israelis if they really wanted to. We understand, though, the Egyptian government at the moment hates Hamas. They hate the Muslim Brotherhood. And the one thing that has been keeping Egypt really on tense terms with the Turks has been the fact that, of course, Erdogan's government has been a huge sponsor and backer of the Muslim Brotherhood and the entire Syrian debacle. So the Egyptians are, I think, if anything, are probably the most skeptical Sunni Muslim nation. They are very concerned about that Qatari Turkish influence of an Islamic, shall we say, Sharia-based democratic revolution. When the Egyptian junta that basically rules Egypt really has this militarized aristocracy that controls that country. Egypt is very far from being a standard Middle Eastern democracy. It very much has a very similar to the Field Marshal Haftar government situation ongoing at the moment. And this is why Egypt probably has stood back and then sort of closed its eyes on the Palestinian Gaza massacre, because it is not friendly towards Hamas. It doesn't like this sort of Sunni Salafi opposition to the Israelis. They would rather prefer think a government similar to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Palestinian Authority, something more moderate. But in fact, I think the Egyptians, they've sort of waited on the sidelines for too long, and all of those subsidies they receive from the Suez Canal, or even direct donations by the United States, basically in all kinds of financial aid, because Egypt's population is just so big. Egypt has a larger population than Iran and Turkey, 120 million people, so it's pretty much the size of Russia, and the economy isn't exactly doing the best. So Egypt at the moment, I think, is really still fence-sitting at this point, but Hakan Fidan's visit, I think, is a big signal towards, well, could we have the Sunni-Muslim alliance beyond, say, countries like Pakistan, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and Turkey? Could we get Libya, for example, at least Field Marshal Haftar and Egypt's government involved? I mean, this is almost like a new OPEC, a new leverage position from which maybe the Sunni Muslim states, even bypassing U.S. interests, could potentially pressure Israel. Unfortunately, Conrad, as we all understand, the Mecca Agreement, this new defense, this trilateral defense pact, as well as Egyptians, the involvement of the Egyptians, most likely this is all posturing, this is all PR, a PR stunt, and probably the primary consideration is, can we have a united front against Iran in the first instance? And this is because the U.S. presence, CENTCOM, U.S. pulling the strings in the background, be it funding the Egyptians, being Trump's visit to Ankara recently, Trump's involvement basically being best friends of Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, his connection to Epstein, for example, U.S. collaboration with the Pakistanis in the Afghanistan war and the intervention in Afghanistan. All these Sunni Muslim countries are connected to America, and even if they, for example, view Israel as some sort of long-term adversary, they are well and truly under the influence of the greater military-industrial complex of the United States. So to say that the Sunni Muslim Ummah will unite against American interests, I think is incorrect, at least not until Iran falls and those goals are met. So at this point, though, it is somewhat hopeful, I think, from if I was a Sunni Muslim, I think I would see this as somewhat of a beneficial move. At least Hakan Fidan is at least showing his teeth and showing that, look, Turkey diplomatically can extend its arm to much larger countries than itself. Like Egypt does have such a predominant population. If you recall, historically, after the fall of Constantinople, there was a long sort of tit-for-tat pull of who exactly will become the next caliph. Will it be the emir or the sultan based out of Cairo, or will it be the Turkish leadership? Who will exactly take over the leadership in the Sunni Muslim caliphate in the 1500s, 1600s? That was a massive debate in the Muslim world. And of course, so this particular pull between these two countries, I think if it comes to a consensus and they unite, I think this will cause at least Israel some things to think about, and there will be some pools for concern. I do want to mention one more thing, Conrad, and this was foreshadowed in previous weeks. Initially, I thought this was fake news, but apparently Hezbollah also understands the threats coming in from the Turkish-backed Syrian HDS government. So even the leader of Hezbollah, Naim Qassem, has openly mentioned that he's actually willing, for the sake of brotherly diplomacy and cooperation, to meet with the government in Damascus if it means Hezbollah can sort of come to an understanding, so there's no more cross-sectional Islamic bloodshed, and so these Syrian Takfiri radicals don't end up invading Lebanon. So Naim Qassem is actually going out of his way, almost like Sayyid Nasrallah in decades past, to rebuild a relationship to prevent the Syrian radical Sunni Muslims to be used as a battering ram against the people of Lebanon. I think that was made on the 4th of August, that statement by Naim Qassem, and so far we haven't really seen an invitation officially to bring him to Damascus. Not that that's safe in any case. I think if Naim Qassem comes out in the open and appears in the presidential palace of Damascus with, for example, al-Jilani to discuss diplomacy, the Israelis will just bomb both of them in the same location. There's no doubt about that. They've done worse things in Tehran and other places around the world. The level of arrogance is absolutely overwhelming. So at this stage, Conrad, we do see, the Sunni Muslim world trying to reshuffle itself and renegotiate certain factors, but it all appears too late and somewhat hypocritical as we sort of approach this basically third year anniversary of the 7th of October commencement of the genocide of the Palestinians of Gaza, which in the end, those of us with longer than short-term memories can, of course, remember what exactly has happened when all of these Muslim countries simply sat back and watched that genocide happen. I think similar things will happen when the invasion of Iran commences. There will be this closing of the eyes, and of course the crimes will sort of perpetrate themselves, and there will be no allies in the Middle East for Iran besides those nations and groups which we mentioned earlier, be it the Yemenis, Houthis, the groups within Iraq, and again the brave Hezbollah fighters of southern Lebanon who will be standing up for the Iranian regime. I think these Sunni Muslim nations well and truly are out for their own interests, first and foremost.
No, I agree. And I think it's interesting, though, to think about. I mean, look, I think the big strike is coming. I think that's what we're waiting for here at the end of August or the beginning of September. But here's an example we had of some thinking I might be having. We have this comment from Deputy Foreign Minister of Iran, Qassem Gharibabadi. He says the Strait of Hormuz has been Iranian, is Iranian, and will always remain Iranian. The strait will only be closed and opened under Iran's command. As long as you, Trump, do not accept the reality of defeat and cease your fanciful delusions, Iran will continue to enforce its closure. So again, my perspective is this strike will come, and then once that's dealt with, Israel will either use this energy to go against their other enemies, they'll wait some time to go against Turkey, or they'll fail to go against Iran, accept some, new cope status quo that allows the U.S. and Israel to save face, and then direct all their energy against Turkey and the new emerging Sunni axis that you just talked about, Dmitry, with Egypt, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. Again, Turkey really being, I think, the leader here. Sure, Pakistan has the nukes. Saudi Arabia's got Mecca. Egypt has, the largest population. But fundamentally, Turkey, they're the NATO member. They're the civilization state. They're the ones that got HTS and al-Jawlani in power in Syria. And just in the past few weeks, Hamas has relocated almost all of its covert activities to Turkey. So it's important to remember that. And what happened almost exactly a year ago as well, one day before the assassination of Charlie Kirk, on September 10th, 2025, on September 9th, 2025, Israel unilaterally struck Doha, Qatar, targeting Hamas infrastructure and locations. They didn't kill anybody, but it was sort of the follow-up to their assassination strike on Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, the former head of Hamas, who was there visiting for, I believe was it Ibrahim Raisi's funeral, or it was somebody else's funeral that he was there for? Regardless, remember that strike. I mean, I could see very easily Israel doing those exact same kind of strikes on Turkey, whether it just targets Hamas leadership or it just targets Erdogan. Regardless, Turkey would feel a lot of pressure to respond to Israel if they really, really did something like that. And it's important, again, to remember the importance of these moves in Libya, Dmitry, like you're talking about, and that America and Turkish officials have been traveling to Libya to try to unite the factions there. Again, somebody has been striking against Haftar-backed groups. They've blamed the GNU, the Tripoli-backed government there, which historically has been, of course, supported by Turkey and Erdogan. But again, there's also reports of different sabotage groups. Of course, Ukrainian groups operate in Libya and target Russian shadow tankers there. So one of the most chaotic places, now that Syria is governed by one government, Libya is really the true model of the Israeli failed state that, that's what the Jews want to turn your country into if you challenge their hegemony anywhere. They want you to be this failed state with open slave markets and rapes and genocides and fighting factions and just, all sorts of different actors around the world coming in and using you as a staging ground for all sorts of covert operations. But, that comes together. Again, the prophecies aren't just about Erdogan being assassinated coming back from Syria. There's also talk it could be from Libya. So you see all of this happening, this potential Sunni axis in Libya, Egypt, Syria, all surrounding Israel. They're like, all right, we have to take out the ringleader. Who's organizing all of this? Well, it's Erdogan and Hakan Fidan. So, perhaps Israel surprises the world and shoots down Erdogan as he's returning from one of these places as they feel particularly threatened. And of course, again, in 2016, something just like that was supposed to occur. But again, that assassination against Erdogan, that intelligence just coming out about how that was supposed to go down. If you want the details, listen to my stream on Tuesday. It's interesting because this same week, of course, we got the news about this Trump assassination attempt, supposedly from Israel, the intelligence there. This is from antiwar.com. It says CIA had low confidence in Israeli intel about alleged Iranian assassination plot against Trump. U.S. intelligence officials were skeptical of Israeli intelligence that claimed there was a threat of an Iranian assassination plot against President Trump at the NATO summit in Ankara last month, which prompted the Secret Service to secretly move him to a military aircraft, the Washington Post has reported. A U.S. official speaking to the Post described the intelligence, which was conveyed by Israel to the CIA, as Israel-derived, not U.S.-generated, and viewed as low confidence. Middle East Eye first reported that the intelligence came from Israel and cited Turkish sources who said that Turkey suspected Israel had fabricated the intelligence to derail diplomacy between the U.S. and Iran and also potentially strain the relationship between Trump and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. According to the Post, U.S. intelligence officials reached a conclusion similar to that of officials in Ankara. Some U.S. officials saw Israel's sharing of the warning about threats to Trump's life as designed less to inform them than to influence the president's decision-making in U.S. policy in the region. Apparently responding to the incident, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi warned the U.S. to be wary of fake intelligence. The U.S. has long miscalculated due to intelligence failures, case in point, the war in Iran. Now, an even bigger miscalculation on the Strait of Hormuz. Worse than fake news is fake intelligence. Be careful. Allah is great, greater than any power on earth, and Allah we trust, the Iranian diplomat wrote on X. President Trump confirmed the plane swap, saying he did so because he followed the Secret Service's direction. One of the U.S. officials speaking to the Post said that the Secret Service went ahead with the swap despite the lack of confidence in the intelligence due to the previous attempts against Trump's life. The Secret Service had 3 near misses with this president, so they're not taking any chances, the official said. They did what they had to do. And again, this is obviously more like predictive programming. Just like with Erdogan, they're just now releasing this intelligence about how, he was supposed to be shot down during the coup attempt in 2016. Well, Israel definitely wants to shoot down Erdogan. We know the prophecies talk about his fall, and some saints have speculated it will come at the hands of the Jews. And Trump, right now, who would benefit from a supposed Iranian assassination against Trump? Because that's who would get blamed for it. Obviously not Iran. They would face the full fury of the U.S. military. None of these regional countries would benefit from it. Only Israel, literally exclusively Israel. And Israel is seeding the idea, again, in the media that that's what they do, predictive programming. They make it known to you so that when inevitably something crazy, some black swan event like this happens, you don't start questioning it. You say, that's not so surprising because the idea was already seeded in your mind. And again, it's the CIA that's now coming out and saying that this intelligence that led to the whole beverage cart plane swap situation was that this was bad, that this intelligence was wrong. And again, it sort of reveals a bit of a battle that's going on behind the scenes. If you look at how this is going on between potentially a faction in the CIA who is maybe more Israel critical or less willing to go along with the full Zionist agenda that, seems to be frankly pulling apart the American empire. And then the battle between them and CENTCOM, of course, the most powerful regional operation in the United States military that controls the Middle East and is entirely infiltrated by Israel. From CIG here, it says, U.S. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper is actively pushing for renewed U.S. strikes on Iran, together with Israel, saying the fighting in Iran must be renewed to attack national infrastructure, including sites in the gas, oil, and electricity industries, per Israeli Channel 13. Cooper also told IDF senior officials, we may very well have no choice but to resume fighting and will need you for joint strikes. Israel says the Trump administration's demand last week to close all fronts with Iran is not the plan anymore. On August 10th, Brad Cooper went to Israel to pick up a prize handed to him personally by the Israeli Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir. Cooper reportedly told the Israelis, you are a nation of warriors, and the people sitting here are the leaders of those warriors, Cooper told the officers. I'm proud to serve shoulder to shoulder with you. Cooper doubled down on the U.S.'s commitment to Israel. A CNN article details Cooper's close relations with the leadership of the IDF, mentioning that him and Eyal Zamir talk multiple times per day, that Cooper knows every IDF general and most of its colonels too, but it goes even deeper. According to CNN, Admiral Brad Cooper has a deep connection to Israel, one that comes from the heart, dating back to the time Cooper commanded the U.S. Fifth Fleet stationed at NSA Bahrain. It was Cooper who placed an Israeli liaison officer at NSA Bahrain. So we basically have the most powerful officer in the military besides the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff himself, Dan Kane. Brad Cooper is just an Israeli agent pushing to get us back into war. And again, you think about which factions in the CIA might go against this. I mean, think about this. You have these people talking to the Post about how they didn't view this threat against Trump as credible. You have Joe Kent, who was one of the first people to quit the Trump administration. When the war went on, he's a former CIA officer. You have John Kiriakou, who has burst on the scene, more relevant than ever, former CIA, very much against the war in Iran, against Israel. You have Tucker Carlson, who platforms both of those people, who, of course, himself, obviously through his father, is also affiliated with the CIA. So interesting factionalism here, I think, emerging in the deep state. And I think some of these, waspier, less Jewish, more Goyim aligned, you've got Kent, Carlson, Kiriakou. These aren't exactly your, Bergs, Edelsteins, Feinbergs that you find in the Pentagon or, below Hegseth in the Department of War and these other names. So there's definitely some elite factionalism going on here. And I think the CIA is fighting back a bit against CENTCOM, but undoubtedly I think CENTCOM and Israel are still very much in the driver's seat here. But regardless, Erdogan and Trump, I think, are the two most relevant geopolitical leaders here. Of course, Putin and Xi are obviously the two other big players, but when it comes to the conflict in the Middle East right now, I think Erdogan and Trump are the kings, and of course Israel would be looking to threaten them, influence them as much as possible. And of course, what do the prophecies say? They say that once Erdogan falls and the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits are closed to the Russians, the Russians will descend down on the Turks, and they'll make it all the way down to Mount Tabor, the gates of Jerusalem, And again, in the midst of all of this, likely the Zionist entity will cease to exist in its current form as well. So that's why so much of this is important. And what will trigger that Russian dissent, like I said, the closure of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. And just in this past week, apparently, there's been pressure from NATO allies for Ankara and Turkey to bypass and make concessions regarding the Montreux Convention and potentially allow NATO and other military vessels into the Black Sea through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. Of course, Russian and Ukrainian black military vessels are not allowed through, and in theory, to remain neutral. Others shouldn't be allowed through as well. But also in the past 2 weeks, the Turkish authority responsible for monitoring the management of heavy commercial cargoes through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits has reportedly started restricting the passage of vessels bound to and from Russian and Ukrainian ports. Sources told Bloomberg the Directorate General of Coastal Safety has implemented de facto restrictions by halting the issuance of transit permits or deliberately dragging out the review of applications. Ships bound for Turkish, Bulgarian, Romanian, and Georgian ports are being allowed to proceed as normal. So, of course, some of these waivers apparently have kicked up again in the past few days, but generally speaking, the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits are becoming something that isn't just a guaranteed pass-through for Ukrainian and Russian ships. The insurance companies for these shipping companies carrying the grain, carrying the energy, are also refusing to insure things. Of course, we're going to get into the Odessa blockade here in a second, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this with Erdogan and the Straits, Dmitry, because Igor Strelkov, I believe, predicted this, because what else happened this week? Of course, it was the new deal between the Syrian government and the Russians regarding the bases in Tartus and Hmaim and the Latakia region of Syria. This is from Sana and the War Reporter. It says, after 18 months of negotiations, Russia and Syria have reached an agreement on the future of Russia's presence at Hmaim and Tartus. After the memorandum, civilian facilities, including Hmaim Airport and Tartus's port's fourth commercial berth, will gradually return to Syrian state management. Military facilities will be restructured into joint Syrian-Russian training centers rather than operating as traditional military bases. The transition is expected to be completed within 3 months. So they claim this is after 18 months of negotiations, but this all comes right after Turkey seems to be clamping down on the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits for specifically Russian ships. So I'd love your thoughts on the prophecies, Erdogan, everything going on in the Eastern Mediterranean, and of course, this latest update regarding Syria and Russia.
These latest updates are, I think, absolutely insane. For those who have been really following in depth and paying attention to some of the news stories we've been informing you, dear listeners, about, this is, of course, an escalation which I think we really haven't anticipated in a while. And firstly, I'll just commence with the fact that Lebanon this week, and this ties directly into Syria, has basically Joseph Aoun just on the side, and Nawaf Salam, right, obviously the leader of the Sunni Muslims, and both of those particular factions in the Lebanese parliament have basically passed a law to end the death penalty in Lebanon. Why exactly that is the case and why they elected this particular period of time to pass it by, I'm not exactly sure. There's also been clemency granted to former Lebanese personnel who have been, again, during the Lebanese civil war and other conflicts, they've been actually forced to leave Lebanon, apparently for collaborating with Israel. These people have now been given clemency. They can now return to Lebanon and they won't be prosecuted. So there's big changes within Lebanon, and the anti-death penalty position against capital punishment in Lebanon, I mean, that's completely insane to pass such a law when there's clearly going to be not just Mossad infiltrator spies, but also saboteurs coming in from Sunni Muslim factions, Mossad, Zionist factions. I think there's a wrong time to do this sort of thing. And it's almost like counter-signaling Iran, which is carrying out, you can almost say, pretty exclusive death penalty sentences against all of these bad actors within its own nation state, and I think rightfully so. It's interesting that we do have Syria actually, pushes for an open in absentia conviction for Bashar al-Assad and Maher al-Assad, his brother, and of course another member of the Assad government, Atef Najib. Najib is actually, he didn't manage to leave Syria, so he's currently in prison as basically on Syrian death row in Damascus. But Bashar al-Assad and Maher al-Assad they are in Moscow somewhere, they are in the Russian Federation, what me and Conrad would probably refer to as house arrest, because look, they're not able, Maher al-Assad and Bashar are not actually able to give any formal speaking exhibitions. Their children have left social media entirely, despite the fact that they are, in their 20s. They're basically Zoomers. The Assad family at this point is in complete media blackout for some mysterious reason, which I don't think I want to dwell on for too long. But definitely the death penalty sort of brought around by this head-chopping government in Syria has basically said that, look, Bashar al-Assad, for all of his crimes committed against the Syrian people. And specifically, I'll read it out. It's the premeditated and intentional murder of more than one person and of children, as well as torture, arbitrary arrest, and crimes against humanity. So the head choppers have declared Bashar al-Assad, basically, that he needs to be executed, and they've asked for his extradition from Russia into Syria to face justice. Now, that's probably not going to happen, but notice, Conrad, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has not even commented on this particular sentence. They haven't provided any of their exhaustive reasons as to why that's incorrect. They're simply completely silent. Maria Zakharova is silent. Sergei Lavrov is silent. They are too, dare I say, they are too craven and a little bit too worried and anxious to actually respond to the government in Damascus because, well, they have nothing to say about that. And Russia is trying to grease the wheels. They're trying to lubricate that relationship between the Russian Federation and the head chopping government in Damascus, as strange as it may seem. And this, of course, comes, and how does this relate to the Turkey issue? Well, because the Russian government has officially agreed to a deal with the new head chopping government in Damascus that they will share the Latakia Khmeimim airbase located on the northern coast of Syria and on the southern coast of Syria, that they will share the Tartus military base located in the Tartus harbors and docks that the Russians have been using for close to a decade now. And so the Russians will allow now head chopping Syrian army personnel onto these two respective bases. The Russians will have joint training sessions with them. They will be training these Syrian personnel in, for example, using Russian aviation units, no doubt helicopters. They'll be training. And the Russians, by the way, are very skilled at training foreign fighters. I mean, they've done that during the Cold War, all kinds of, Africa guerrilla warfare fighters during the communist days, Zimbabwe is being a good example, Rhodesia, various other African countries. And they've continued to do so even in this new period of the Russian Federation, when you see the African Corps, Wagner training foreign military units around the world. And definitely there are Russians who can fluently speak Arabic, and they can actually teach these head choppers a thing or two, no doubt, about tactics, CQB, close range combat, reconnaissance, etc. These Marsky Diavoli tactics. I'm not going to say they're going to create a SEAL Team 6 for the Syrian head choppers, but something akin to that, no doubt the Russians will be doing at Tartus. Or in fact, maybe even giving them instructions on naval warfare, as crazy as it may sound, because the Syrian armed forces at the moment, they lack a proper navy, they lack a proper air force, so Syrian pilots do need training, and the Russians can give that to them at Tartus and Latakia Khmeimim, and that's generally overall a negative thing, because we understand the Syrian government is almost directly run by Erdogan and by the Turks at the very least, and of course it's directly sponsored by the GCC states, which are in existential, I think, opposition to Russia if you really look at the bigger picture and zoom out. So Russia's losing more and more leverage in the Middle East. This is very unfortunate and bad news, and basically, almost as Igor Strelkov predicted years ago, this is putting the last nail in this Russian expedition into Syria coffin, and I would say it's somewhat disrespectful even to the Russian dead who fought for the freedom of the Syrian people against the head choppers, against ISIS, against these evil rebels who've brought so many misdeeds and evils against the Christians of the Levant and of the greater Middle East, that Syrian heartland. All of that was for what? For the head choppers to take over and for you to train them into the future. So I'm not very happy about that decision. Many Russian patriots are cringing at this, including Dr. Yurievich, who said he fought with the members in Deir ez-Zor and at Palmyra, and the Russians, again, fought against these head choppers for so long, and yet now it's a massive collaboration streak. Again, this is massive loss of face for the government within the Kremlin. We'll see exactly what this turns into, but at the moment, there's no need to cope about this. This is another, of course, foreign policy L being taken. And yes, the Russians can still use Tartus, but just don't forget that the UAE has signed a deal with the Syrian government in July of 2025 for $800 million for the UAE businesses to come in and basically reshape the ports in Tartus and reconfigure all of the facilities there. So eventually, no doubt, the GCC countries will come in and run the port of Tartus in the south of the Syrian coast almost in its entirety, and the Russians, no doubt, will be pushed out in their entirety. So you're giving the passcodes to all of your doors to basically former members of Al-Qaeda and head choppers. And this matters because now the Russians will be they'll have to more or less take all of their major military assets away from these two bases. They will be entirely unsafe. They could be infiltrated. They could be used by these essentially Turkish assets within Syria. And so the closing of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, I think, is basically almost completely solidifies that Russian loss over a presence in the Middle East at least at this point. Besides that northern base located in Armenia, in Gyumri, major L, very, very sad, I think, long-term and mid-term development for the Russian Federation. But it's really important to note that this is, again, a major escalation. Turkey, as we know, has doubled down on the fact that neither Ukrainian nor Russian military naval vessels can be translated from the Mediterranean into the Black Sea. The Bosphorus and Dardanelles are completely closed for anything besides commercial vessels. So this is huge. So the Russian Black Sea fleet ships, if they wanted to, for example, protect or if they wanted, for example, to go for military or naval maneuvers and maritime maneuvers in Tartus or in Libya, they would be completely cut off from that particular point. This is, if the Russian vessels wanted to translate themselves into the Sea of Arabia to literally float side by side with the American fleet, even to posture, the Turks would not allow that. The Turks basically have locked the Russians into the Black Sea as a lake, as an internal lake. So it's completely almost escalatory in the fact that if the Russians were to request it and Erdogan was to deny that, there's no doubt that this would lead to an eventual conflict, at least on a diplomatic end, and maybe even it will end up in a military conflict, as the prophecies foretell, between the Russians and the Turks. And the Russians, no doubt, there are still Russian personnel in Syria now that they're well and truly not just being integrated, but they are surrounded by head choppers. If there are crimes against these Russian personnel, just like we mentioned the potential prospective crimes against the Russian scientists in the Bushehr nuclear power plant, which Putin confirmed that there are Russian specialists in Iran at the moment, the Russians will need to defend their own citizens as per normative international relations behavior. They will need to bring those fleets back into the Eastern Mediterranean. And how will they do that if Turkey will not allow such recourse? And so the Russians will inevitably be forced to escalate against the Turks. So just keep this in mind. And I say this because the situation in the Black Sea has been completely blown out of any form of proportions. All the norms of, shall we say, civil behavior between the Ukrainians and the Russians have fallen apart entirely. Not just is there bombing of civilian vessels by both sides, the Russians have shot at least 7 Ukrainian commercial vessels in the Black Sea this week, perhaps even more. The 3 ports located in Odessa have been getting struck. Again, the Russian angle from all of this is that we are striking arms depots and basically targets which are supplying the Ukrainian military. But truth be told, almost every single portion of the Ukrainian military at the moment, the Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, and be it any sort of commercial major business within Ukraine, is paying its taxes towards the larger Ukrainian war machine. So I guess with that sort of justification, you can strike at any target within Ukraine, any energy facility, any power plant and claim, or any warehouse and claim, look, this is because this money is trickling down almost like Reaganite economics into the Ukrainian private military industrial complex to support the genocide of the people of the Donbass. So that logic the Ukrainians are also using against the Russians and claiming that the Russian economy needs to be brought to a standstill, and so we'll be bombing Russian ports, Russian vessels in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. And even more provocative was a Ukrainian drone strike against Novorossiysk, which we mentioned many times. One of Putin's Putin's Grey Cardinal, Nicholas Patrushev, former head of the FSB, former major member of the Soviet KGB. This is like a very mysterious man, definitely one of the most hardcore Siloviki within the Russian government. Nicholas Patrushev was assigned to basically renovate the Russian Black Sea fleet and turn them into, I suppose, provide them some anti-drone technologies. He was given this position of curatorship over the Russian Black Sea Fleet Navy. And this position he was put into, I believe, a few years ago, maybe 2023. And the Russian Black Sea Fleet, since the sinking of the Moskva flagship, coincidentally, I believe, which took place around the Jewish feast day, I believe it was either Purim or since the sinking of the Moskva flagship, the Russian Black Sea Fleet has essentially been relatively offline and stationed in these water ports located on the east coast of the Black Sea, specifically Novorossiysk. And why this matters is because on the 12th of August, Ukraine, and these claims are not 100% confirmed by the Russian sources, so I say allegedly and speculatively. I don't want to spread Ukrainian misinformation, but allegedly Ukraine has struck with drone forces against the new flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Admiral Makarov and the Admiral Essen. And these are basically Russian missile frigates, which could be maybe compared to American destroyers. So the Russian Black Sea Fleet has five major ships. so to speak, 6 major ships if you count the Kriva-class cruisers. And those are, of course, the new Mercury ship, which has, again, had issues translating into the Black Sea because it essentially was doing maneuvers in the Baltic. And, of course, in 2023, when it tried to enter into the Black Sea, the Turks were basically trying to stall it, and there was a German escort for the ship. But there was the Mercury ship, there's the Admiral Makarov, Admiral Essen, the Admiral Grigorievich, and then the 2 smaller ships, Petlivoy and Ladny. And the Petlivoy and Ladny are actually quite small. They're more or less like corvettes or very small cruisers. But the Admiral Essen and the Makarov, these are the 2 ships which Ukraine claims to have struck against, and one of them being the new flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. So all of those years of preparation, Russia preparing its Black Sea Fleet for some perhaps amphibious or naval operation against Ukraine, these are some of Russia's most, shall we say, renewed naval warfare units have now been struck. I'm not sure if they've been taken offline or simply damaged, or maybe those drones have been shot down, but the fact that Ukraine is trying to attack the Russian Black Sea Fleet Navy, this is a huge escalation point. And the reason why it matters, obviously, is because the Black Sea Fleet will be one of the most important assets in the Russians expanding to take those territories located in the southwestern corner of Ukraine. That is that sort of Odessa peninsula area where Odessa, of course, coincidentally meets Moldova and Pridnestrovia. If the Ukrainians ever try to strike out against those particular regions, that's what will escalate the situation to a point where the Russian Black Sea Fleet will need to engage the Ukrainians, despite all of the issues with submarine drones and overhead drones striking at the Russian ships with impunity. So at this stage, the Russian commercial and the naval assets within the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov are experiencing a lot of hardship. And no doubt about that, President Putin, I think this week, appearing sort of his visitation to the east coast of the Russian Federation, specifically to Iturup Island in Japan, visiting as well the cities of Khabarovsk, located in far Siberia, visiting Sakhalin, for example, and meeting with the leaders of the Russian Pacific Fleet, specifically on the Varyag, which is probably the largest Russian ship in the Black Sea, in the Pacific Russian Fleet Navy. It was almost a signal. And Putin putting on like the uniform of the commander of the Russian naval forces as well, coincidentally in the same week as the Ukrainian strike against the Admiral Essen and the Makarov in the Black Sea Fleet. I mean, this is clear symbolism. Ukraine is basically saying, well, Putin, you're the head of the Navy. We will be striking against some of your major assets right here while you're cruising around visiting these, as the Ukraine would claim, these Japanese-occupied islands. And at the same time, again, this causes an entire issue with Japan, where the new prime minister of Japan announces that the Russians are again overstepping and they're signaling anti-Japanese messages, that the occupation of the Kuril Islands, etc., when, these are all, of course, victorious trophies from the end of the Second World War, and Russia really doesn't want to relitigate all of this. Again, Vladimir Putin probably had reasons for signaling all of this, and maybe there was a pro-Chinese, maybe pro-North Korean leaning to all of this, and to claim that, look, Japan really is on the wrong side of geopolitical affairs at this stage. Japan still has 15 plus American bases, 30 plus American bases located in Okinawa, but on the Japanese mainlands, on the island, especially on Hokkaido as well, Japan is really in the wrong place at the wrong time in terms of its allyship in the coming Third World War. I think Putin was signaling that to the Japanese, but at this stage, it looks like the Ukrainians have elected essentially to escalate almost completely, not just in the maritime theater of the Black Sea and Sea of Azov, Conrad, but also on the land. There's major strikes in Bashkortostan, oil refineries struck deep within Tatarstan, and I think this is probably the bloodiest strike that we've seen thus far. There was at least 13 killed. This is, of course, located in Tatarstan. Nizhnekamsk, which has a major oil refinery located there, and the explosions ended up killing 13 people. So this is probably the largest loss of life deep within Russia, 1,100 kilometers away from the front lines. So Ukrainians are flying these drones literally along the Russian-Kazakhstan border, all through Rostov-on-Don. It's unclear exactly how the Ukrainian drones are bypassing all of the Russian air defense systems as well as the Russian radars. But again, the Russian-European landmass is so large and vast, there are clearly some gray areas. And the Russians are retaliating for all of these strikes against the warehouses, which there have been more this week, and there have been more refinery hits. The Russians are retaliating very strongly with tactical caliber Kinjal, as well as more Zircon missile strikes against targets, most of them on the outskirts of Kiev, hitting some of these warehouses and storage facilities. Yes, those strikes also bring about civilian deaths. So both sides have completely begun to empty out their long-range arsenals, and really no hold barred at this stage. Both countries are completely adamant and bringing their respective economies to an almost entire standstill. There's none of this sort of quiet eye closing on the grain shipment deals happening in the Black Sea. At this point, it does look like a total war scenario, which frankly, it probably should have been from the beginning. There should not have been much trade between two nations declaring, Ukraine declaring the Russians as a Nazi invasive aggressive state, and the Russians declaring Ukraine as a satanic Western globalist state that wants to destroy the Slavs of the Donbass, and the Russians located there, and this Russophobic Banderite. So both sides have been using hardcore rhetoric, but only now is the conflict itself, the bloodshed, the destruction of civilian infrastructure really escalating to a point where it'll be hard to imagine some sort of temporary short-term ceasefire being signed along this new line of conflict. And specifically in terms of the movement on the front lines, we discussed these long-range deep strikes by both countries, but the real movement on the front lines is the Russians have deeply progressed towards the Brapilya, which is one of the Ukrainian strongholds next to the Dnipropetrovskaya Oblast. This is a particular location which is very key because in a way it allows the Russians, it's located just north of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, it allows the Russians to wrap around and perhaps create, and again, we've said cauldron a lot of times on this show, and there haven't been that many cauldrons. I think there's been one cauldron in the Kursk Oblast a year and a half ago, but at this stage, the Russians potentially will be creating a large surround around the areas of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Zhushkovka, completely cutting them off. And so instead of headfirst besieging these three cities, which are located in very short intervals between one another, in fact, they almost create this almost like a trench chain of bunkers, right? These three bunker cities. The Russians can in fact surround the entire territory of the three cities by going into Dobrapilya, taking that, and then from the north, taking Liman and moving around, taking Svetogorsk Monastery, liberating that Lavra located there, and surrounding the three cities of Zhushkovka, Slavyansk, and Kramatorsk, and perhaps, essentially starving the Ukrainian defenders, forcing them into basically surrendering, and just basically hopefully the government within Kiev will be able to concede these territories to the Russians, and then that will result in the entirety of the Donetsk People's Republic being liberated. There's been a little bit of progression as well in the Kharkovskaya Oblast around Kupiansk and Volchansk, but again, we're talking about movements of roughly 1 to 2 kilometers and several villages being taken. So the Russians, in fact, are creating more of these buffer zones in Kharkovskaya Oblast, which are not Russian constitutional territories, and in the Dnipropetrovskaya Oblast, where some villages are being taken. And it's been already said by multiple Russian analysts that once the Russians expanded into Sumskaya, Kharkovskaya, the Dnipropetrovskaya Oblast, these territories will be later conceded to the Ukraine and basically traded as chips. The Russians will say, look, you can give us this territories in Kherson or Zaporozhye, and we will give you back your constitutional territory. So maybe I would say these are bargaining chips for future territorial exchanges. That's how we should probably view it. But these battles before Zhushkovka, Kramatorsk, and Slavyansk, these are fundamental, foundational battles for the entire goal of the special military operation, why it even started to begin with. And so the Russians, no doubt, the Kremlin, the reputation of Vladimir Putin and his entire presidency hinges on liberating these particular three cities and the entirety of the Donbass. I mean, everything is high stakes at this stage. But yes, both countries are suffering civilian casualties, life loss, and certainly within Russia, there are major questions as to how, for example, President Putin can even travel to the Far East and, put on this naval uniform and posture about the Russian Pacific Fleet, which has been incredibly inactive, and besides military and naval maneuvers with the Chinese Navy, for example. But how can he even do that while there are deep strikes happening within European and the south of the Ural Mountains, within these locations, within Russia itself? And people feel incredibly unsafe. I don't even want to refer to the drone strikes. Every single week there's been thousands of drone strikes against both the Russians and Ukrainians respectively. In fact, drone strikes have escalated to insane numbers. We're talking tens of thousands of drones being shot down, specifically by the Russians, with every single month, thousands per week. So the numbers are really scaling beyond anything the world has ever seen in its entire history. This is a true robotic warfare. And in fact, helicopters, haven't been used, I think, for the entirety of 2026. Not a single helicopter by both sides and even tank warfare has really been drawn down to almost a complete halt and crawl. At this stage, Conrad, it does appear that the Russians, again, making this incremental progress on the front lines, but these strikes against the Russian Admiral Makarov and Essen, I would say, from the Black Sea Navy, considering they're the two largest ships within the Russian Black Sea Navy, if these reports are true and they were struck, and even if they were damaged, I mean, this is a huge blow to Russian naval reputation, but also the Ukrainians have crossed another red line, and big questions as to how the Russians will respond to that. Will the Russians use their 6 ships in the Black Sea to actually push the battle forward and actually engage the Ukrainians on the waters, which I think it's well and truly past time for them to do that and actually engage in a proper amphibious naval warfare as they've done in centuries past. We've just celebrated last week the feast day of Saint Admiral Ushakov, who of course sailed on these Black Seas, and the Russians have all of these great saints and they need to pray to them for assistance, and at this stage more than ever.
I agree with everything you just said there, Dmitry. And again, we've said since the very beginning of this show, I mean, one, we're going to be talking about a lot of the stuff that the news will be talking about eventually, but because of the prophetic perspective that we have from the saints, we're going to be, talking about it first. And we were talking about Odessa blockade and all of this stuff. I mean, we were talking about it even before the Duran was, and the Duran were 3 weeks ahead of the mainstream media talking about it. And of course, here we are. People dispute whether or not it's World War III. We discussed Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. These are all being challenged and closed. I mean, we talked about Gibraltar with Ceuta and everything previous weeks. I mean, every major strait and trade corridor is being affected. The most surplus, the most valuable grain corridor, the Odessa corridor. I mean, the grain trade is being massively disrupted with the disruptions there. The energy trade from Russia, I mean, up to 45% supposedly of Russia's energy was taken offline, lowering exports. I mean, Russia has suspended diesel exports until 2026. This is Third World War level stuff. I mean, not even completely excluding the actual fighting going on in the Middle East and Ukraine. The level of trade and worldwide economic disruption is indisputably the Third World War. And when you bring in the amount of drones, like you said, Dmitry, just the sheer amount of new modern aerial technology, missile technology being deployed here, this is unprecedented, and this is an era of warfare that we will undoubtedly look back on as something. We will, of course, call it the Third World War, but it will be, if it's called something else, it will be something that's meant to encompass that, I think, even more than it already is. And the question becomes, will the Russians rise to the occasion? Of course, we didn't just say from the beginning of the show that, much like St. Paisios said, the prophecies will become headlines, they'll become the news. That's what's happening now. But we also said that the Russians will not, they're not going to ideologically descend down on the Turks or even launch across the Ukrainian steppe with a fury. All of this will be forced upon them. And look, you're being struck, like you said, thousands of kilometers into your territory. Dozens of people are dying in Tatarstan. I mean, these are people that did nothing to do with the war going on. You have these blockades. You have the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits closing. You're targeting their ships. They're targeting your ships in the Black Sea. This deal is just made in Syria. The Balkan situation, the Caucasus situation is obviously heating up. I mean, look, we're going to talk about Serbia and the Balkans here in a second. The Russians, are you going to rise to the occasion or not? Look, we said that they're going to be forced into it, but they're going to be forced into it, I guess, against their own will. They're going to be kicking and screaming, trying to do nothing, make sure nothing ever happens. They're going to have to rise to the occasion. And the question is, will they? And I think, like I've said before, it's going to seem like they're down and out. It's going to seem like the Russians have no interest in being a serious civilization, when I think suddenly something will change, something will shift, and then there will be a massive bombardment. And I think, as Metropolitan Neophytosa said, we know how that's going to go. It'll be against the Turks, and we will see what goes on there. And at this point, like I said, we're just waiting for Erdogan to fall. But as far as the situation in Ukraine itself, the biggest development that I noticed this week was Zelensky's visit to Belgrade to meet, speaking of nothing ever happens, to meet with the Chudjak himself, Vucic, who, again, not like Dmitry and I are big Vucic fans on the show, but whatever little defense we had of him left is pretty much gone here. This guy is just a total goober. But of course, Zelensky went there to try to secure direct shell shipments, ammunition shipments from Serbia. Of course, apparently $800 million plus worth of Serbian ammunition has already made its way to Ukraine through other countries, because Serbia is one of the main ammunition providers to Czechia, Slovakia, Poland, all these other countries that willingly give all of their ammunition away to Ukraine. Vucic claims that military matters weren't discussed, so there's no direct deal. But in visiting, Zelensky made sure that he recognized Serbian claims and autonomy over Kosovo, basically denying the existence of Kosovo as an individual independent state. Kosovo then immediately pulled the massive Ukraine flag down from the Pristina City Hall government building, complaining about Ukraine and all of this. So again, Vucic, alienating the Russians, Zelensky alienating, some of their NATO, Balkan, Albanian, Kosovar allies, I guess. But Serbia is the one that makes the ammunition, and Zelensky desperately needs ammunition. But apparently he didn't secure any new supply lines. But of course, that's what Vucic is going to say. I mean, what's next? Is Russia going to recognize Kosovo in response? I assume not. But the funniest news out of all of this was Vucic announced that Serbia plans to open a drone factory in September, with the opening expected to take place around September 15th to 20th. And you might assume, it must be in collaboration with Ukraine and all of their drones. And he added that while Ukraine has extensive drone production capabilities, the Serbian project will be carried out in cooperation with a different country. And if you guessed it, that's right, Israel. So they're collaborating with Ukraine. They're like, who else can we collaborate with to try to really help our country out? I know, the Zionist entity. So, Serbia is meeting with Zelensky, hugging him, supporting him, and then they're building a new drone production facility with Israel. I mean, I'm sorry, Serb bros, but something has to be done here. This is not okay. But before we talk about church news, Dmitry, I'd love your thoughts on the Vucic, Serbia, Zelensky situation.
Yeah, I think what brings more complexity into the entire picture is that Vucic, in a way, as much as he is influenced by, say, Russia and sort of Serbia's general appeal to Russian heritage, the sort of Slavophile links of the Serbian past, I think he's also heavily influenced by right-wing politicians within Europe, being the Prime Minister Orban, who's now lost his seat, be it Romanian politicians, the Poles. Serbians are looking around, and what are they seeing? The right-wingers in Spain, for example, other member EU states, the Serbians are seeing pro-Zionist, right-wing governments basically across Europe, or oppositionary parties, and they're saying, look, this is normative. If we want to be anti-Islamic, if we want to be anti-Kosovar, anti-Albanian, we have to, in a way, have a more amicable relationship with Israel. And this is unfortunately like a very bad influence, because most of these European parties are either, again, subverted, maybe they're taking Talmudic money, or perhaps they're just completely incorrect with their sort of long-term projections as to where the chips will fall eventually. And unfortunately, look, Germany isn't really helping in this particular case, because they have, just 2 days ago, they've allocated an additional 3 million euros to the Kosovo security forces. So there's this understanding that, the Serbians need to be held at bay, and for the the independence of the people of Kosovo, the Muslims being there, and of course the Serbians, this only increases Serbian agitation. We understand the Serbians, eventually there will be special military operations, probably carried out by Vucic's, shall we say, successors, if there is a right-wing turn within Serbian politics, and those special military operations will be targeting, of course, Montenegro, and they will be targeting, no doubt, first and foremost, Kosovo. And I think when NATO begins to crumble, sort of break apart at the seams, potentially even as the situation escalates between Erdogan, Greece, and Russia, there's no doubt the Serbians will be also making their major moves, because the opportunities will be provided to them. NATO will be either frozen or completely defunct at that point, and the sort of absence of security, absence of accountability in the international theater of generally European politics, similar to the charades taking place during the Second World War, of the various countries changing borders and shifting lines of power. There's no doubt the Serbians will be making their move, and hopefully, Vucic will not be the leader of Serbia at that stage. But at this point, there's also views of the Republika Srpska potentially seeking independence. We've also sort of discussed that as like the last shard, potentially even the most based Serbian remnant that there is. And in fact, Milorad Dodik could be even that future leader that the Serbian people require, even if he is maybe more amenable towards the Israelis than, say, Vucic is himself. But look, he has met up with Lukashenko in the past. He's met with Putin. He's very much pro-Russian. So Republika Srpska could be that, that particular injection of clarity into the Serbian mind. But I think until the Russians turn into what we may call the future Russian Tsardom, until Russia reinvigorates itself, I think the Serbians will always be, unfortunately, somewhat, their political views will unfortunately always be tainted. They'll somewhat be Europeanized, and they'll always have this somewhat of a cuckold take, at least in foreign policy, towards the Israelis. And there won't be any understanding until the Russians, on a foreign political sense, will address the Israeli question, the elephant in the room, and until the Russians really put it to the Israelis and challenge them. I think the Serbians will remain very, very confused on the issue. They simply do not have the bravado to make these independent decisions. And in the Orthodox sense, I think that's completely right, because you do have Serbia's neighbors, such as Greece, are completely pro-Israeli. So it's not like there's going to be any positive influence coming in from the old Orthodox Christian peoples of the south of the Balkans. So it's all up to Russia to sort of, again, force normality back into diplomatic relations. How do you deal with these Talmudic terror states in the world? And, the Serbians may be influenced in a positive way in the future.
No, it's true. And look at Greece. They're allied with Israel, despite the fact that like 80+% of their population is like aware of the Jewish question. Same with Serbia. People are very aware of this stuff, despite the fact that they allow their disdain for their Muslim neighbors and the enemies of their predecessors to, let them to see sort of an enemy of my enemy is my friend situation with the Jews. Very similar situation in certain Russian circles, especially Soviet boomers that still have World War II nostalgia and take pride in like being the number one true goyim, Shabbos goys of the Jews that fought against Germany and invaded Europe on behalf of some shtetl dwellers. But think about the situation, right? We know about the prophecies. Saint John Baptist will rise up, and we talk about how there needs to be generals and there will be leaders of other countries. So he will also hopefully raise up and work with pious Russian czar as well as a Serbian czar as well. And there are prophecies about how a lot of this Third World War stuff will even begin potentially in the Balkans, that the Turks will facilitate agitation through the immigrants and the Muslims that they send to that region. They'll support the Kosovar Albanians. And look, just in the past few years since starting this show, we've seen several flare-ups in Kosovo, in Republika Srpska, between Bosniaks, between Republika Srpska authorities and the Bosnian UN High Commission authorities there, as well as on the Kosovo-Serbia border. Monasteries have been raided, people have been shot, borders have been closed several times. I myself have been to the Republika Srpska border. It's a bit of a tenuous situation because most of the time it's fully open because it's of course part of the country of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but Dodik has enforced the border several times and has resisted the central authorities. So I think undoubtedly the Balkans is one of, I think, the main contenders for sort of a sleeper black swan event that will lead to a cascading domino, series of events that will lead to what we know about Russia and Turkey in the Middle East and Palestine and Syria, which again is what we've been talking about all day on the show. So that's where all of that goes, I think, regarding the situation again between Vučić and Zelensky. I think, again, whether there is some kind of color revolution because there's a lot of disdain for Vučić and movement to protest against him, or someone else just succeeds him, I think it's going to be, like you said, Dmitry, they will go with the wind. And whether the Russian bloc kind of succeeds and is powerful enough for the Serbs to see a vision there, they will perhaps stick with, quote unquote multipolarity. But if that's not true and Russia is going to wait till the very end to sort of emerge out, Serbia may unfortunately be absorbed into the European Union before some of these events end up going down. But moving on to the church persecution situation, not a huge amount of stories this week. This is all I have. And this is from orthochristian.com. It says, His Eminence Metropolitan Luke of Zaporozhye of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is calling on his flock to respond with prayer rather than anger after Ukraine's State Service for Ethnopolitics and Freedom of Conscience opened an investigation into the diocese's ties to the Moscow Patriarchate, a pretext for eventually banning the diocese altogether. In an appeal to the clergy and faithful of the Zaporozhye Diocese, Metropolitan Luke says he learned of the investigation from media reports, calling it bitter news. As it is done to other dioceses and monasteries, the State Service is examining whether the Zaporozhye Diocese's administration answers to a foreign religious organization. The hierarch calls on the faithful not to respond to the accusation with anger or hostility. The whole history of the church tells us of a different path, he says. We'll go through this trial as we've gone through all previous ones, with the gospel in hand and with that spiritual experience which for centuries has helped the church remain faithful to Christ, even when it seemed the whole world was rising up against it. You can strip away a name with a stroke of a pen, seize walls and property by force, but no one can never tear Christ out of the human heart. The appeal reads, invoking St. John Chrysostom's teaching that the church can be persecuted but never conquered by human power. He encourages his flock, let us ask God whether near, far, let us ask God that neither fear nor irritation, nor most dangerous of all, hatred, find a place in our hearts. We don't know what other trials await us ahead, but we know firmly and believe with all our heart that the one who is stronger than any earthly power is with us. Therefore, my dear ones, don't be afraid and don't lose heart. Strengthen yourselves with prayer, fasting, the church's sacraments, and what's especially important now, mutual love for one another. Metropolitan Luke calls on the faithful to intensify prayer and fasting and asks them to gather daily at 9 p.m. for a shared prayer for Viktor Zelensky, the head of the state service, and all who hate, oppress, or wrong our mother church and all of us. It asks the faithful to observe the coming Dormition fast with particular spiritual focus and repentance. Similar investigations by the state service have already affected several other dioceses and monasteries of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, including a probe that found the Koretsky convent and the Pochaev Lavra affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church, putting that convent's operations at risk of a ban. So I think this was a beautiful exhortation from Metropolitan Luke, really one of the most obvious, examples of someone calling on his flock to pray for those directly persecuting them. So beautiful to see, despite the fact that it is disturbing and very concerning that once again our taxpayer dollars are supporting this blatant, demonic, Talmudic evil.
Completely right. And just some of the news coming out of Ukraine, I mean, this is some of them, of course, incredibly tragic. There was a Russian drone flying over the city of Kramatorsk, which is now the Russians are within 10 kilometers of that particular, basically, fortress city located in the Donetsk People's Republic occupied by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians shot down this drone, and the drone smashed into the St. Alexander Nevsky Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and commenced a huge fire. Commenced basically, the entire ceiling started burning. There's footage filmed by the firefighters, probably for propaganda purposes. They're not actually trying even to put out the fires. The entire roof burnt up, similar to, of course, some of the other drones that have collapsed, or anti-air missiles that have fallen on the roofs of churches and cathedrals in the past. This is typically the result. You don't see massive explosions. It's just fires commence, and yeah, very, very tragic. But I think more and more churches, it's just like the footage we've had out of Avdiivka, Pokrovsk, Tarietsk, will be damaged in the coming fighting. So that's probably the worst news, and sort of a premeditation of what's to come. Really, and this is a little bit comical, dare I say, Bishop Mark of Rahovsk, this was a Ukrainian Orthodox Christian bishop, completely canonical. He met with members of the 128th Zakarpatsia Storm Brigade. So this is a Ukrainian hardcore military infantry brigade, and he, as well as some of his priests, they sort of took a photograph with the flag of this brigade. And the flag is, again, this is why is an Orthodox Christian bishop taking photos of a Ukrainian, I don't want to say neo-Nazi brigade, but there are these particular symbols. One of the Zakarpatsia Brigade's symbol is, of course, the mythological beast Cerberus, the free-headed hell dog that is located, it's on a shield and on the Ukrainian colored background. So Bishop Mark, next to Cerberus, I mean, I didn't really have that on my bingo card list for 2026, but that's what's happening. So you do have these Ukrainian mythological, maybe paganistic symbols, hearkening back to even more, so some of the most extreme symbology of the Second World War. But even beyond that, they're sort of inventing their own mythological creatures and trying to obtain the appeal of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And I don't even think the bishops of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church even know how to adequately react to this. So they just take the photos and move on. But it doesn't spell good things, I think, for overall view of warfare from an Orthodox Christian, maybe even Ukrainian perspective. In any case, speaking about views of war and conflict, Patriarch Kirill released a new book this week, or at least it's been announced, but the book is, I believe, in some form of circulation. The book is called War, Beyond Visible Causes and Effects. And on the title page, you do see the word war in full caps. Then, of course, the subtitle, you have an old icon of St. George, the great martyr slaying the dragon, and the author's name is this is the Giga Chad. It just says Patriarch of Moscow and all Rus, Kirill. Not even his last name, just the title. That's who I am. This is my book. And so this particular book, interesting, is Patriarch Kirill. I mean, he must have been working on this for quite a while, perhaps even prior to the special military operation commencing. But the book, to summarize, it's the primate of the Russian Orthodox Church's book is devoted to the metaphysics of war. Concepts such as sacrifice, patriotism, victory, and other examples are examined from a unique spiritual perspective. His Holiness discusses the redemptive significance and consequences of war, Russia's metaphysical boundaries and goal setting, and touches on the racial aspects of war. Since everything in the world stems from the clash of good and evil, the outcome of war is determined by God, and the winner is on the side of light. Our earthly calling is to be warriors of the Lord, to resist evil and to defend lofty moral ideals. While affirming the Russian people have the power to win, the primate also points to the great responsibility of not shirking our historical duty to be the victors. The only thing I'll point out is, and myself and Conrad, we haven't read the book yet. In fact, I don't even think it's available in English. I'll try to obtain a Russian copy and read it myself if it's available. But the book is well and truly probably be sold out very soon. If the Patriarch of the largest local Orthodox Church personally writes a book about war, I mean, that's a pretty big deal. It's really rare that we get the sort of insight. What are his personal opinions as the hierarch of the largest Orthodox local church? I mean, this is really interesting. So it'll be good to see, but most likely it'll be something amidst what St. Nicholas Velimirovich wrote in the 1930s, his book on war, the biblical view of warfare, or maybe Ivan Ilyin's book as well on resisting evil by force. I think it'll be something amidst that, but maybe with more injections of modernity and some of these modern conflicts that have shaped the Russian world, which is, again, the concept of the Russian world is a very novel idea. Patriarch Kirill basically was one of the progenitors of it. So just to point out, and I think the one thing that, and I'm sort of foreshadowing my criticism of the book in a way, I think the one thing the book will not be mentioning is the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church, especially its officials, the metropolitans, its patriarchs, have always held on to this potential to criticize a particular leader of the Russian Orthodox state. And in the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire was the same. Sometimes when the emperor would go into a conflict which was not entirely justified or maybe was incorrect in some way, the patriarchs would chastise them. Or maybe if some sort of war crimes were carried out, etc., the patriarch would have the freedom to criticize the particular Orthodox Christian leader. The most interesting example of that is the last patriarch before the Petrine reforms in Russia was Patriarch Adrian of Moscow. So in the late 1600s, when Peter the Great went to war against the Turks, he composed an entire, Peter the Great had wanted to take Crimea from the Turks and the Crimean Tatars. So he composed this massive, more or less mercenary army led by German Lutherans. And there was a few Russians in the army, but he wanted the Patriarch to bless this expedition to retake Crimea. And Patriarch Adrian said, look, I'm not going to bless an army with like Muslim mercenaries, Protestant mercenaries, Roman Catholics, just like this mixed, not just mixed race, but like the mixed co-religionist coalition to fight against the Islamic Caliphate. That just won't be happening. So Patriarch Adrian refused to bless the military expedition of Peter the Great outright. And maybe that's what can maybe partially contributed to Peter the Great, the Russian Tsar, eventually sort of changing the way the Russian Orthodox Church operated from a patriarchal system into a more synodal, collective, collegial form of control and unity, because the patriarch had this individual perspective and he could actually have a personal input and criticize the leader of even a Russian Orthodox emperor and Tsar on his decisions to engage in certain warfares and how even, who he allied with. So the Russian patriarch, for example, could critique Putin for allying with the jihadis of Taliban, for example, or the head choppers of Syria. But I don't think we'll be getting into any of that because Patriarch Kirill, unfortunately, for all of his amazing feats in recent years, he's not really been the sort of patriarch and local church leader who has criticized the government of Russia at all. In fact, it's mostly been a very sort of friendly relationship between him and United Russia. But the book will be interesting to read in any case, and once we do read it, no doubt I'll provide at least some sort of succinct review of this particular book because it relates to, I think, the content on this show very, very much. So it'll be good to see what the patriarch has written about, specifically even maybe references to prophecies and what has been taking place in Ukraine in recent years, and maybe even the Middle East. So it would be really good to see all of that. But it's been an entirely packed week, Conrad. As we know, we're basically on the brink of major escalation, and it'll be good to see where all the chips fall at the end of the week. So, dear listeners, please stay tuned. Follow all of the correct social medias. So many more important news to come, no doubt.
No, the news about the book from the Patriarch is fascinating. Perhaps it'll be a bit of a good antidote to Putin's, frankly, I'll just say it, coal post on Tucker Carlson about how he doesn't see religion really playing a role in world affairs and politics in that way, very Soviet boomer kind of postmodern type perspective. So maybe Patriarch Kirill, who, advises Putin, is, connected with him. Maybe he can provide a bit of a counterbalance to that. I'm very interested in seeing the book. And if the book is, again, I'm not saying the book will be bad, but there's a chance the book is sort of, not necessarily saying anything that hasn't already been said by the good people you mentioned earlier, Dmitry, Ivan Ilyin, Saint Nikolai Velimirovich, these other saints. But if it is something truly, worth reading that brings something new to the table from, an actual, perspective of spiritual, wisdom and exploration, then that would be something that I think would be great in the English language as well. So thank you all as well so much for tuning in to the end of this incredible episode. Obviously, pray for the persecuted church in Ukraine. Pray for those fighting in wars all around the world, whether they be in the military of your country or anywhere else, of course, especially those that are Orthodox Christians. Of course, like Dmitry said, be sure to like the episode. Be sure to subscribe at worldwarnow.co. That's the best way to support us. Get behind the paywall there. Check out this week's incredible conversation with Denny from Ubi Petrus. Great friend of the show, and really someone whose content I've watched for a very, very long time, years before World War Now even began. So check that out, as well as our previous week's discussions with Jose Nino, with Jakub Saraf, with Father Peter Hears. A lot of really great stuff there to, assuage and whet your whet your appetite. Really some of the best podcast content on the internet as far as I'm concerned. Of course, we also have our my interviews with Gabriel Doroshin and the St. Alexander Nevsky Brigade at the front lines in Russia, Ukraine, fully available in video form for those that are behind the paywall. I should probably start linking those again to people because there's a lot of new folks. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Be sure to like the episode regardless of where you're listening. If you're not subscribed on the Substack, be sure to do that, whether you're a free or a paid subscriber, because again, you can become a free subscriber as well. Just get on the email list at worldwarnow.co. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Just search World War Now on YouTube and it'll come up. Follow us on X at World War Now _. You can also, of course, find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, really anywhere where podcasts are found. Like our content there. Give us 5 stars. Leave a comment. We love hearing from you across all of these places. Be sure to follow me on X at GnomeRad. You can also support us at buymeacoffee.com/World War Now. Probably the best way to donate directly to the cause. Keep the lights on here at the proverbial World War Now bunker. Of course, be sure to check out antelopehillpublishing.com. Use code WWN for 10% off all of your dissident literature. Again, I'm reading The Burning Souls by Leon Degrelle right now. You can also get Culture of Critique in its 3rd edition exclusively from Antelope Hill. Again, from Kevin MacDonald, really essential to understanding the Jewish question. They have a whole host of other incredible works as well. Translations, dissident titles, not available anywhere else. So check them out at antelopehillpublishing.com. And again, code WWN for 10% off there at the end. Again, thank you all so much for making it to the end of this episode. Leave a like. It really helps us out. We're rising through the Substack ranks slowly but surely. So leave a comment. Help us get that engagement. Again, worldwarnow.co. Get behind the paywall to listen to the incredible Ether Hour suite. And we will see you on the next one. God bless.